The year 1161 marked a pivotal moment in the annals of Outremer, as Baldwin IV entered the world within the limestone walls of Jerusalem's royal palace, his birth cry echoing through chambers that had witnessed the triumphs and tribulations of 3 generations of Crusader kings. Born to Amalric I of Jerusalem and Agnes of Courtenay, the infant prince represented the continuation of a dynasty that had carved out a Christian kingdom in the heart of the Islamic world, yet his arrival occurred during a period when the very foundations of that achievement faced unprecedented challenges. The House of Jerusalem, established by Godfrey of Bouillon following the First Crusade's capture of the Holy City in 1099, had evolved into a sophisticated feudal monarchy that balanced European traditions with the practical necessities of governing a diverse population in a hostile environment. Baldwin IV's lineage traced directly through this royal house, his grandfather Baldwin III having ruled with distinction until his death in 1163, when the young prince was merely 2 years old. The succession passed smoothly to Amalric I, Baldwin IV's father, who inherited not only the crown but also the mounting pressures that would define his son's future reign. The political landscape of the Levant in the 1160s presented a complex tapestry of competing powers, shifting alliances and emerging threats that would profoundly shape the young prince's upbringing. The Crusader states of Outremer, comprising the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli, had reached their zenith of territorial control and political influence by the mid-12th century. Yet, this apparent strength masked underlying vulnerabilities that astute observers could already detect. The most significant threat emanating from the Islamic world came not from the fractured Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, which had long served as a source of wealth through tribute and occasional military cooperation, but from the north, where Nur ad-Din Zengi had consolidated power in Aleppo and Damascus. This formidable ruler had inherited his father's ambitions, but possessed greater strategic acumen and religious fervour. Nur ad-Din's court in Damascus buzzed with scholars, theologians and military commanders, united by a vision of jihad that transcended the traditional boundaries separating Sunni and Shia Muslims. His expansion southward threatened to encircle the Crusader states, while his propaganda machine worked tirelessly to present him as the champion of Islamic unity against the Christian invaders. The fragmentation of Muslim territories, which had initially favoured Crusader expansion, was beginning to reverse under Nur ad-Din's methodical approach to conquest and consolidation. Unlike previous Islamic leaders who had focused primarily on military campaigns, Nur ad-Din understood that lasting victory required ideological cohesion, administrative efficiency, and economic stability. His madrasas in Damascus and Aleppo produced a generation of educated administrators and religious scholars who viewed the reconquest of Jerusalem not merely as a political objective, but as a sacred duty ordained by divine will. Within this volatile environment, the Crusader nobility maintained their elaborate feudal hierarchies, their stone castles dotting the landscape from the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan Valley. The military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights, provided professional military expertise and maintained extensive networks of fortifications. Yet their sometimes competing interests and fierce independence created additional layers of political complexity. Young Baldwin's early years unfolded within this intricate web of political manoeuvring and military preparedness. The royal court in Jerusalem functioned as the nerve centre of Crusader power, where European knights, local nobles, Italian merchants and ecclesiastical dignitaries gathered to conduct the business of governing a kingdom that stretched from the Lebanese mountains to the approaches of the Sinai Peninsula. The palace itself served as a physical manifestation of the cultural synthesis that characterized Crusader society. The young prince received his education under the tutelage of William of Tyre, a scholar whose intellectual credentials and political acumen made him one of the most influential figures in the kingdom. William had studied in Paris and Bologna, mastering not only classical texts but also contemporary developments in theology, law, and natural philosophy. His appointment as Baldwin's tutor reflected the royal family's commitment to providing their heir with an education befitting a ruler who would need to navigate the complexities of governing a multicultural kingdom while maintaining relationships with European powers and defending against Islamic reconquest. William's pedagogical approach emphasized practical statecraft alongside traditional scholarly subjects. The future king learned Latin and French, studied the chronicles of previous Crusader rulers, and received instruction in military tactics and siege warfare. More importantly, William ensured that Baldwin understood the delicate balance required to maintain Crusader rule, the necessity of accommodating local customs while preserving European feudal structures, the importance of maintaining profitable relationships with Italian maritime republics, and the constant need to secure military and financial support from Western Europe. During these formative years, subtle signs began to emerge that would fundamentally alter Baldwin's destiny and the future of the kingdom itself. Around the age of 9, the prince began exhibiting symptoms that initially appeared minor but gradually revealed their sinister nature. William of Tyre, whose chronicle provides the most detailed contemporary account of these developments, noticed that Baldwin showed unusual insensitivity to pain during physical activities and games with other noble children. The first clear indication occurred during a typical afternoon when Baldwin and his companions engaged in the rough play common among medieval nobility's children. While other boys cried out when pinched or struck during their games, Baldwin remained remarkably stoic, showing no reaction to stimuli that should have caused discomfort or pain. William initially attributed this apparent bravery to the prince's noble character, viewing it as evidence of the courage expected from future kings. However, as these incidents multiplied and became more pronounced, William's scholarly training and keen observation skills led him to recognise the troubling implications of Baldwin's condition. The absence of pain sensation, combined with subtle changes in the prince's complexion and the texture of his skin, pointed toward a diagnosis that would have catastrophic implications for the royal succession and the kingdom's political stability. Medieval medical understanding of leprosy, known then as the disease of the soul, derived from biblical precedents and classical medical texts, particularly the works of Galen and Avicenna. The condition was viewed through multiple lenses, as a divine punishment for sin, as a test of faith similar to Job's trials, or as a physical manifestation of spiritual corruption. These theological interpretations carried profound political implications, as a leprous king would be seen by many as cursed by God, potentially invalidating his right to rule and undermining the divine sanction that legitimised Crusader presence in the Holy Land. William of Tyre faced an impossible dilemma as he gradually confirmed his suspicions about Baldwin's condition. The tutor's position required him to serve both the prince's educational needs and the kingdom's political interests, yet these obligations increasingly conflicted as the reality of Baldwin's leprosy became undeniable. The decision to conceal the diagnosis reflected not merely personal loyalty, but a calculated assessment of the catastrophic consequences that public knowledge would bring. The implications of having a leprous heir in a medieval Christian kingdom extended far beyond medical concerns into the realm of political theology and dynastic legitimacy. Medieval kingship rested on the concept of divine appointment, with rulers serving as God's representatives on earth. Physical perfection was considered essential for royal authority, as bodily wholeness symbolized spiritual purity and divine favour. Deformity or disease, particularly leprosy with its biblical associations, could be interpreted as evidence of divine displeasure or moral corruption. In the specific context of the Crusader states, these concerns carried additional weight due to the kingdom's unique position as a Christian outpost surrounded by Islamic powers. The Crusader nobility's legitimacy depended partly on their claim to be executing God's will in recovering the Holy Land from infidel control. A leprous king would provide powerful propaganda ammunition for Islamic leaders like Nur ad-Din, who could argue that Christian rule had been divinely rejected. The succession concerns created by Baldwin's condition involved multiple layers of complexity within the feudal structure of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The High Court of Jerusalem, composed of the kingdom's major vassals, possessed significant influence over royal succession, particularly in cases where the designated heir's fitness to rule came into question. The military orders, with their international connections and independent resources, represented additional power centres that could potentially challenge or support royal authority, depending on their assessment of the situation. Furthermore, the kingdom's relationships with the Byzantine Empire, the various Italian maritime republics, and the papal court in Rome all hinged partly on perceptions of royal legitimacy and divine favour. News of a leprous heir could potentially undermine diplomatic relationships, reduce financial support from Western Europe, and encourage opportunistic attacks from neighbouring Islamic powers, who might interpret the situation as evidence of Christian weakness. William of Tyre's attempts to manage this crisis required extraordinary discretion and political sophistication. The tutor needed to continue Baldwin's education, while gradually preparing him for the unique challenges he would face as a leprous ruler, all while maintaining absolute secrecy about the diagnosis. This delicate balancing act involved limiting the prince's public appearances, carefully controlling his interactions with other nobles and visiting dignitaries, and developing strategies to minimize the visible symptoms of his advancing condition. The physical progression of Baldwin's leprosy during these early years followed the typical pattern of the disease, with initial numbness and insensitivity gradually accompanied by more visible changes in skin texture and coloration. Medieval medical treatments, based largely on classical texts and Islamic medical scholarship, offered limited relief and no prospect of cure. The available remedies included various herbal preparations, dietary modifications, and bloodletting procedures that reflected contemporary understanding of humoral medicine, but provided little actual benefit. As Baldwin approached adolescence, the challenges of concealing his condition became increasingly difficult, while the political stakes continued to rise. The kingdom faced mounting pressure from Nur ad-Din's expanding influence, internal tensions among the Crusader nobility, and the constant need to secure support from Western Europe for ongoing military campaigns. Against this backdrop of escalating challenges, the secret of Baldwin's leprosy represented a ticking time bomb that threatened to destabilise the entire political structure of Outremer. The young prince's awareness of his condition and its implications developed gradually as William of Tyre carefully introduced him to the realities of his situation. This education required extraordinary sensitivity, as Baldwin needed to understand both the medical aspects of his disease and its political ramifications, while maintaining the psychological resilience necessary for future leadership. The tutor's approach emphasized the historical precedents of rulers who had overcome physical limitations through exceptional character and strategic acumen, while acknowledging the unique challenges that leprosy presented in the medieval Christian context. The discovery of Baldwin's condition transformed William of Tyre's pedagogical approach from conventional royal education into an unprecedented experiment in preparing a leprous prince for kingship. The Archbishop chronicler, whose scholarly reputation extended from the schools of Paris to the libraries of Constantinople, recognised that traditional methods of royal instruction would prove inadequate for a ruler who would face unique challenges stemming from both his physical condition and the political ramifications it carried. William restructured Baldwin's curriculum around an intensive programme of Latin literature that emphasised historical precedents of leadership under adversity. The young prince spent countless hours in the palace scriptorium, his fingers tracing the illuminated manuscripts that contained the works of Livy, Tacitus and Suetonius, absorbing lessons about Roman emperors who had governed effectively, despite physical limitations, or personal challenges. William particularly emphasised the reign of Claudius, whose physical disabilities had initially made him appear unsuitable for imperial power, yet who proved to be one of Rome's most capable administrators. The study of Vegetius's De Re Militari became central to Baldwin's education, with William adapting the classical military treatise to contemporary crusader warfare conditions. Rather than focusing solely on personal combat skills, which Baldwin's progressing leprosy would eventually limit, the curriculum emphasised strategic thinking, logistics, and the coordination of diverse military forces. Baldwin learned to analyse the tactical innovations that had enabled relatively small crusader armies to defeat much larger Muslim forces during the First Crusade, studying the battles of Dorylaeum, Antioch and Jerusalem through detailed accounts preserved in the royal archives. William introduced Baldwin to the complexities of siege warfare through practical exercises using scale models constructed in the palace courtyard. These miniature fortifications, complete with working trebuchets and mangonels, allowed the prince to experiment with different approaches to assault and defence without the physical demands of actual military training. Baldwin demonstrated remarkable aptitude for understanding the mathematical principles underlying siege engines, calculating angles of trajectory and optimal placement of artillery with precision that impressed his tutors. The prince's education in Christian theology went far beyond conventional royal instruction, as William recognised that Baldwin would need exceptional spiritual grounding to counter the inevitable accusations of divine disfavour that his leprosy would provoke. They studied the theological works of Augustine, Aquinas, and contemporary scholars like Peter Abelard, with particular attention to discussions of suffering, divine will, and the relationship between physical condition and spiritual worthiness. William carefully guided Baldwin through biblical accounts of righteous figures who had endured physical afflictions, including Job's trials and the various healing miracles performed by Christ. Byzantine theological texts, available in the royal library through diplomatic exchanges with Constantinople, provided alternative perspectives on the relationship between physical condition and divine favour. These Eastern Christian sources offered more nuanced interpretations of suffering that did not automatically equate disease with sin, giving Baldwin intellectual ammunition to counter Western European prejudices about leprosy. The prince became particularly adept at theological argumentation, developing skills that would later prove crucial in defending his legitimacy against clerical opposition. Baldwin's leprosy paradoxically enhanced certain aspects of his intellectual development, as his physical limitations forced him to rely increasingly on mental acuity and strategic thinking. The gradual loss of sensation in his extremities, which initially manifested as insensitivity to pain, eventually affected his ability to handle weapons and participate in the vigorous physical training typical for medieval nobles. However, this restriction redirected his energies towards scholarly pursuits and theoretical military studies with an intensity that might not have developed under normal circumstances. The prince's unique perspective on mortality, shaped by his awareness of leprosy's progressive nature, influenced his approach to statecraft in ways that distinguished him from his contemporaries. While other young nobles could assume decades of active rule lay ahead, Baldwin understood that his reign would likely be abbreviated, creating urgency in his preparation and a focus on immediate effectiveness rather than long-term dynasty building. This awareness fostered a pragmatic approach to political decision-making that prioritised practical results over traditional ceremonial obligations. William adapted Baldwin's military training to accommodate his physical limitations while maximising his strategic capabilities. Traditional knightly education emphasised personal combat skills, horsemanship, and the ability to lead cavalry charges in heavy armour. As Baldwin's condition progressed, these activities became increasingly difficult, with the prince experiencing reduced grip strength and diminished sensitivity in his hands and feet that made controlling weapons and horses problematic. Instead of abandoning military education entirely, William developed innovative training methods that emphasized command and control rather than personal combat prowess. Baldwin learned to direct military operations from positions that minimized his physical exposure while maximizing his strategic oversight. He practiced coordinating complex maneuvers using messenger systems, horn signals, and banner communications that allowed him to maintain tactical control without requiring direct physical participation in combat. The prince's tactical thinking developed along unconventional lines that would later prove decisive in his campaigns against Saladin. Rather than relying on the traditional crusader preference for heavy cavalry charges, Baldwin learned to appreciate the value of defensive positioning, coordinated infantry formations, and the strategic use of fortified positions. His studies of Muslim military treatises, obtained through diplomatic channels and captured documents, gave him insights into Islamic tactical preferences that most crusader commanders lacked. Baldwin's education included extensive training in the use of military engineers and siege specialists, recognizing that his physical limitations would require him to rely heavily on technological advantages and fortification strategies. He learned to evaluate terrain for defensive advantages, position artillery for maximum effectiveness, and coordinate the complex logistics required to maintain armies in the field. These skills proved particularly valuable given the Kingdom of Jerusalem's limited manpower resources and the need to maximize the effectiveness of available forces. The formation of Baldwin's inner circle began during his educational years, as William carefully selected young nobles and clerics who demonstrated both competence and discretion regarding the prince's condition. Raymond III of Tripoli emerged as one of Baldwin's most important early relationships, despite the significant age difference between them. Raymond, who had become Count of Tripoli in 1152, possessed extensive military experience and sophisticated understanding of Levantine politics that made him an invaluable mentor for the young prince. Raymond's approach to Baldwin's education complemented William of Tyre's scholarly instruction by providing practical insights into the realities of governing Crusader territories. The Count of Tripoli had extensive experience dealing with Muslim neighbours, negotiating truces, managing diverse populations, and coordinating military campaigns with other Crusader states. His pragmatic approach to politics, which sometimes involved cooperation with Muslim rulers when it served Crusader interests, provided Baldwin with alternative models of leadership that differed from the more rigid ideological approaches favoured by some members of the Jerusalem court. The relationship with Reynald of Châtillon developed differently, as this controversial figure represented both the opportunities and dangers inherent in Crusader politics. Reynald had arrived in the East as a younger son seeking fortune and had married Constance of Antioch, becoming Prince of Antioch through matrimonial alliance. His aggressive military campaigns and diplomatic provocations had earned him both admirers and enemies throughout the region, making him a complex figure for Baldwin to evaluate. William of Tyre viewed Reynald with considerable suspicion, recognizing that his impulsive nature and tendency toward military adventurism could destabilize the careful diplomatic balances that maintained Crusader security. However, Baldwin's education included studying Reynald's campaigns as examples of both successful tactical innovation and dangerous strategic overreach. The prince learned to appreciate Reynald's military capabilities while understanding the political risks associated with his aggressive approach to Muslim relations. Baldwin's educational program included regular exposure to the diverse populations within the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as William recognized that effective rule would require understanding of the various communities that comprise the kingdom's subjects. The prince learned Arabic, enabling him to communicate directly with Muslim subjects and negotiate with Islamic leaders without relying entirely on interpreters. This linguistic ability, unusual among Crusader nobles, provided Baldwin with significant advantages in diplomatic negotiations and intelligence gathering. The study of Islamic culture and religion formed an important component of Baldwin's education, as William understood that effective opposition to Muslim reconquest efforts required detailed knowledge of Islamic motivations and strategic thinking. Baldwin read Arabic translations of military treatises, studied Islamic legal principles that governed relations between Muslim rulers and Christian subjects, and learned about the theological foundations of jihad ideology that motivated leaders like Nur ad-Din. Baldwin's education in economic matters reflected the Kingdom of Jerusalem's dependence on trade revenues and the complex financial relationships that sustained Crusader rule. The prince learned about the Italian Maritime Republic's commercial networks, the taxation systems that generated royal revenues, and the financial obligations that bound the various feudal territories to the crown. He studied the mint records that documented the kingdom's monetary policies, and learned to evaluate the economic implications of military campaigns and diplomatic agreements. The prince's understanding of ecclesiastical politics developed through direct observation of the complex relationships between secular and religious authorities in the Crusader states. Baldwin learned to navigate the competing jurisdictions of Latin and Eastern Christian churches, the political ambitions of various religious orders, and the diplomatic connections between local ecclesiastical authorities and the papal court in Rome. This knowledge proved crucial for a ruler whose physical condition would inevitably raise questions about divine favour and religious legitimacy. As Baldwin's formal education progressed, William of Tyre gradually introduced him to the specific challenges he would face as a leprous ruler. The prince learned about historical precedents for rulers with physical disabilities, studied the legal principles governing royal succession in cases of disputed fitness, and developed strategies for maintaining political authority despite visible symptoms of disease. This preparation required extraordinary psychological resilience, as Baldwin needed to accept his condition's limitations while developing the confidence necessary for effective leadership. The prince's education culminated in a sophisticated understanding of statecraft that combined classical learning, contemporary political realities, and innovative approaches to the unique challenges facing the Crusader states. Baldwin emerged from this intensive program with intellectual capabilities that compensated for his physical limitations and strategic insights that would prove decisive in the coming conflicts with Saladin's expanding power. The death of King Amalric on July 11th, 1174, sent shockwaves through the limestone corridors of Jerusalem's royal palace and reverberated across the entire network of Crusader fortifications from Antioch to the Red Sea. The king's sudden demise from dysentery, contracted during his return from a diplomatic mission to Constantinople, caught the kingdom's nobility unprepared despite his recent illness. Amalric had been only 38 years old, in the prime of his political career, and his death created an immediate succession crisis that threatened to unravel the careful diplomatic and military balances he'd spent 13 years constructing. The High Court of Jerusalem convened within hours of the king's death, as barons, ecclesiastical dignitaries, and representatives of the military orders gathered in the palace's great hall to address the unprecedented challenge of a leprous heir. The assembled nobility faced a dilemma without clear precedent in Crusader law or European feudal tradition. Baldwin IV, at 13 years old, possessed the unquestionable legal right to inherit his father's throne. Through primogeniture, yet his advancing leprosy raised fundamental questions about his fitness to rule that extended far beyond concerns about physical capability. Raymond III of Tripoli emerged as the dominant voice in these crucial deliberations. His experience as a ruler and his established relationship with the young prince positioning him as the natural candidate for regent. Raymond's political calculations extended beyond personal loyalty to Baldwin, encompassing a sophisticated analysis of the kingdom's strategic position and the potential consequences of rejecting the legitimate heir. The Count of Tripoli understood that any attempt to bypass Baldwin's succession rights would create dangerous precedents that could destabilize the entire feudal structure of Outremer. The theological implications of crowning a leprous king generated intense debate among the ecclesiastical members of the High Court. Archbishop William of Tyre, despite his personal devotion to Baldwin and intimate knowledge of the prince's capabilities, found himself in the difficult position of defending a succession that many viewed as potentially contrary to divine will. The biblical associations of leprosy with spiritual corruption created powerful arguments against Baldwin's coronation, particularly among clerics who feared that a diseased king would bring divine punishment upon the entire kingdom. However, William marshalled sophisticated theological counter-arguments that drew upon patristic literature and contemporary scholastic thought to challenge the automatic equation of physical condition with spiritual worthiness. He cited the examples of righteous biblical figures who had suffered physical afflictions without losing divine favour, and referenced recent theological developments that distinguished between disease as divine punishment and disease as spiritual trial. The Archbishop's scholarly reputation and his detailed knowledge of Baldwin's character and capabilities proved decisive in swaying clerical opinion toward accepting the succession. The military orders presented additional complications in the succession debate, as their international connections and independent resources made their support crucial for any successful reign. The Knights Templar, under Grand Master Odo de Saint-Amand, expressed particular concerns about the military implications of a leprous king, questioning whether Baldwin could effectively lead armies in the field or maintain the physical presence necessary for inspiring troops in combat. The Hospitallers, led by Grandmaster Jobert of Syria, adopted a more cautious position that emphasized their obligation to serve the legitimate ruler while privately expressing reservations about the long-term implications of Baldwin's condition. The kingdom's secular barons divided along factional lines that reflected existing political tensions within the Crusader nobility. The court party, centred around families like the Ibelins who had risen to prominence through service to previous kings, supported Baldwin's succession as a means of maintaining established power structures. The more recently arrived nobles, particularly those with strong connections to Western Europe, expressed greater skepticism about accepting a leprous ruler, viewing his condition as potentially undermining their own legitimacy and complicating their relationships with European relatives and allies. Agnes of Courtenay, Baldwin's mother, played a crucial but controversial role in securing her son's succession. Her previous marriage to Amalric had been annulled on grounds of consanguinity, a decision that technically rendered Baldwin illegitimate according to strict canonical law. However, papal dispensation had subsequently legitimised the prince's birth, and Agnes leveraged her extensive network of relationships within the Jerusalem court to build support for her son's coronation. Her political manoeuvring during the succession crisis demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Crusader court dynamics and proved instrumental in overcoming opposition to Baldwin's accession. The international implications of Baldwin's succession weighed heavily on the High Court's deliberations, as the kingdom's survival depended partly on maintaining support from Western European powers and the Byzantine Empire. News of a leprous king could potentially reduce the flow of pilgrims and crusaders to the Holy Land, undermine diplomatic relationships with European courts, and provide propaganda opportunities for Islamic leaders who could argue that Christian rule had been divinely rejected. These concerns required careful management to prevent the succession from becoming a source of international embarrassment or political weakness. Despite these formidable obstacles, the High Court ultimately confirmed Baldwin's succession on July 15, 1174, just 4 days after his father's death. The decision reflected both the strength of primogeniture principles in Crusader law and the practical recognition that rejecting the legitimate heir would create even greater political instability than accepting a leprous king. Raymond III of Tripoli received appointment as regent, with authority to govern in Baldwin's name until the young king reached his majority, an arrangement that provided experienced leadership while maintaining the fiction of royal authority. Baldwin's coronation ceremony on July 15, 1174, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, represented a carefully orchestrated attempt to project royal legitimacy while minimizing the visible evidence of his condition. The 13-year-old king wore elaborate robes and gloves that concealed the physical manifestations of his leprosy, while the ceremony's religious symbolism emphasized divine sanction for his rule. Patriarch Amalric of Nestle performed the coronation ritual with appropriate solemnity, his blessing carrying particular weight given the theological controversies surrounding the succession. The new king's physical appearance during the coronation revealed the progression of his condition since William of Tyre's initial diagnosis. Baldwin's face showed subtle but noticeable changes in skin texture and coloration that careful observers could detect despite the ceremonial cosmetics applied for the occasion. His movements displayed the slight stiffness and reduced sensitivity characteristic of advancing leprosy, though these symptoms remained mild enough to avoid shocking the assembled nobility and clergy. The young king's voice retained its clarity and strength, allowing him to recite the coronation oaths with appropriate dignity and conviction. Raymond III's assumption of the regency established a governmental structure that balanced the theoretical authority of the crown with the practical necessities of experienced leadership. The regent's approach emphasized continuity with Amalric I's policies, while adapting to the changed circumstances created by Baldwin's condition and youth. Raymond maintained the previous king's diplomatic initiatives, particularly the complex relationships with Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos and the various Islamic rulers who controlled territories adjacent to the Crusader states. The immediate challenges facing the new reign extended far beyond the succession crisis itself, as the strategic situation in the Levant had deteriorated significantly during Amalric's final years. Saladin's rise to power in Egypt represented the most serious threat to Crusader security since the establishment of the kingdom, as this Kurdish military commander had successfully consolidated control over the Fatimid Caliphate's resources while maintaining nominal allegiance to Nur ad-Din in Damascus. Saladin's political acumen and military capabilities far exceeded those of previous Fatimid leaders, transforming Egypt from a potential ally or neutral party into an active enemy of the Crusader states. The unification of Egypt and Syria under coordinated leadership, a development that Crusader policy had worked for decades to prevent, now appeared increasingly likely as Saladin expanded his influence northward, while Nur ad-Din's power extended southward. This strategic encirclement threatened to cut off the Kingdom of Jerusalem from potential allies and supply routes, while providing Islamic forces with unprecedented resources for sustained military campaigns against Crusader territories. Baldwin's early administrative decisions, made in consultation with Raymond III and other senior advisors, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the kingdom's strategic priorities despite his youth and inexperience. The new king confirmed existing military commanders in their positions, recognizing that continuity of leadership was essential during a period of transition and external threat. He maintained his father's policies regarding taxation and commercial regulation, understanding that economic stability was crucial for financing the military expenditures necessary to counter Saladin's growing power. The young king's approach to ecclesiastical relations reflected lessons learned during his education with William of Tyre, as he carefully balanced respect for clerical authority with assertion of royal prerogatives. Baldwin confirmed existing appointments within the church hierarchy, while ensuring that new positions went to candidates who supported his legitimacy and understood the unique challenges facing a leprous ruler. This policy required delicate negotiation with various religious orders and ecclesiastical factions, as the king needed to maintain clerical support without appearing to compromise royal authority. The military situation inherited by Baldwin IV demanded immediate attention, as Saladin's consolidation of power in Egypt had already begun to affect the strategic balance throughout the region. Intelligence reports reaching Jerusalem indicated that the Kurdish commander was systematically purging potential opponents within the Fatimid administration, while building new military units loyal to his personal authority rather than traditional Egyptian institutions. These developments suggested that Saladin possessed both the political skill and military resources necessary to challenge Crusader dominance in ways that previous Fatimid leaders had never attempted. The kingdom's defensive preparations during Baldwin's early reign reflected both the regent's military experience and the young king's theoretical understanding of strategic principles. Raymond III ordered the reinforcement of key fortifications along the kingdom's borders, particularly those controlling access routes from Egypt and Syria. The great castles of Kerak and Montreal, which commanded the trade routes between Damascus and Cairo, received additional garrisons and supplies to withstand extended sieges. Similarly, the coastal fortifications at Ascalon and Gaza were strengthened to prevent Saladin from establishing naval bases that could threaten communications with Europe. Baldwin's personal involvement in these military preparations remained necessarily limited due to his age and condition, yet he demonstrated keen interest in understanding the strategic principles underlying defensive planning. The young king studied detailed maps of the kingdom's territories, learned to evaluate the defensive capabilities of various fortifications, and developed appreciation for the logistical challenges involved in maintaining military readiness across such an extensive and vulnerable frontier. His theoretical knowledge, gained through intensive study with William of Tyre, proved surprisingly applicable to practical military planning. The diplomatic challenges facing the new reign required careful management of relationships with multiple external powers whose support or neutrality was essential for Crusader survival. The Byzantine Empire, under Manuel I Komnenos, maintained complex relationships with both Crusader states and various Islamic rulers that could shift dramatically based on imperial strategic calculations. Baldwin's administration needed to preserve Byzantine goodwill while avoiding commitments that might compromise the kingdom's independence or draw it into conflicts that served imperial rather than Crusader interests. The Italian maritime republics presented additional diplomatic complexities, as their commercial interests in Levantine trade sometimes conflicted with Crusader military necessities. Venice, Pisa, and Genoa maintained trading relationships with Islamic powers that could potentially provide intelligence or resources to Crusader enemies. Yet, the naval capabilities and commercial networks were essential for maintaining communications with Western Europe and securing necessary supplies for the kingdom's defence. Baldwin's early reign also confronted internal challenges related to the kingdom's diverse population and complex feudal structure. The indigenous Christian communities, including Greek Orthodox, Armenian, and various Eastern Christian groups, required careful management to maintain their loyalty while preserving Latin Catholic supremacy in ecclesiastical matters. These communities possessed valuable knowledge of local conditions and maintained relationships with co-religionists in neighbouring territories that could provide intelligence or diplomatic opportunities, making their continued support crucial for effective governance. The consolidation of Saladin's power in Egypt during the months following Baldwin's coronation represented a seismic shift in the political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean that would define the remainder of the young king's reign. Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin, had arrived in Egypt in 1169 as a subordinate officer in his uncle Shirkuh's military expedition, ostensibly serving Nur ad-Din's interests in preventing Crusader expansion into Fatimid territories. However, the Kurdish commander's political acumen and military capabilities far exceeded those of a typical lieutenant, and by 1174 he had systematically eliminated potential rivals within the Fatimid administration, while building a power base that increasingly operated independently of Damascus. Saladin's approach to consolidating control differed markedly from previous Islamic leaders who had relied primarily on military conquest or religious authority. The Kurdish commander understood that lasting power required administrative efficiency, economic prosperity, and ideological legitimacy that transcended traditional ethnic and sectarian divisions within Islamic society. His systematic purge of the Fatimid court during 1174 and 1175 eliminated not only potential political opponents, but also the elaborate ceremonial apparatus that had characterized Shia rule in Egypt for 2 centuries. The transformation of Egypt's military structure under Saladin's direction created immediate strategic implications for the Crusader states. The Fatimid army had traditionally consisted largely of slave soldiers and mercenary units with limited cohesion and questionable loyalty to central authority. Saladin replaced this system with a professional military organisation based on Kurdish and Turkish officers who owed their positions directly to his patronage, supplemented by Arab tribal contingents whose leaders received generous land grants and commercial privileges in exchange for military service. Intelligence reports reaching Jerusalem during late 1174 described Saladin's methodical approach to military reorganisation with growing alarm. The Kurdish commander had established training camps throughout the Nile Delta, where recruits learned coordinated battlefield manoeuvres, siege warfare techniques, and the use of advanced military technologies including Greek fire and improved siege engines. These developments suggested that future Egyptian military campaigns would possess tactical sophistication and strategic coordination that previous Fatimid expeditions had notably lacked. Saladin's economic policies during his early years in power demonstrated understanding of the financial foundations necessary to sustain prolonged military campaigns against the Crusader states. Rather than simply extracting maximum revenue from Egyptian territories through taxation and confiscation, the Kurdish commander implemented administrative reforms that increased agricultural productivity, expanded commercial networks, and attracted merchants from throughout the Islamic world to Alexandria and Cairo. These policies generated substantial revenues that could be directed towards military expenditures while maintaining popular support among Egypt's diverse population. The ideological dimension of Saladin's rise proved equally significant for Crusader strategic planning. Unlike the Fatimid caliphs, who had maintained Shia religious practices that created theological tensions with Sunni Muslims throughout the region, Saladin publicly embraced Orthodox Sunni Islam while positioning himself as a champion of Islamic unity against Christian occupation of Muslim territories. His court in Cairo attracted scholars, poets, and religious authorities who crafted propaganda that presented the Kurdish commander as the divinely appointed leader of Islamic reconquest efforts. Baldwin's first direct military experience occurred during Saladin's initial probing attacks against Crusader territories in late 1174 and early 1175. These expeditions, nominally conducted to test Crusader defensive capabilities and gather intelligence about the kingdom's military readiness, provided the young king with practical lessons in warfare that complemented his theoretical education under William of Tyre. The 15-year-old monarch accompanied Raymond III and other experienced commanders on reconnaissance missions along the kingdom's southern borders, observing firsthand the tactical challenges involved in defending extensive frontiers against mobile enemy forces. The strategic importance of controlling trade routes became immediately apparent during these early confrontations, as Saladin's forces systematically targeted commercial caravans travelling between Damascus and Cairo through Crusader territories. The great fortress of Kerak, commanded by Reynald of Châtillon since his marriage to Stephanie of Milly in 1177, occupied a crucial position overlooking the King's Highway that connected the major Islamic centres of Syria and Egypt. Saladin's attempts to establish alternative routes that bypassed Crusader control demonstrated his understanding that economic warfare could prove as effective as direct military assault in weakening the kingdom's defensive capabilities. Baldwin's participation in the defence of these trade routes revealed both his growing tactical acumen and the physical limitations imposed by his advancing leprosy. The young king could no longer participate directly in cavalry charges or engage in hand-to-hand combat, as his reduced grip strength and diminished sensitivity made controlling weapons and horses increasingly difficult. However, his theoretical knowledge of military strategy proved remarkably applicable to practical battlefield situations, and his ability to coordinate complex maneuvers through messenger systems and signal communications impressed veteran commanders who had initially questioned his military capabilities. The fortified positions along the kingdom's borders assumed critical importance as Saladin's power expanded and his military capabilities improved. The castle of Montreal, situated southeast of the Dead Sea, controlled access to the Red Sea ports that provided alternative routes for trade between Egypt and the Islamic territories of Arabia and the Indian Ocean. Saladin's early campaigns included systematic reconnaissance of these fortifications, with his engineers studying their defensive weaknesses and his intelligence operatives attempting to gather information about garrison strengths and supply arrangements. Baldwin's growing reputation, despite his physical limitations, stemmed partly from his innovative approaches to defensive warfare that maximized technological advantages while minimizing the importance of personal combat prowess. The young king demonstrated particular aptitude for coordinating siege defense, understanding the mathematical principles underlying artillery placement and the logistical requirements for maintaining prolonged resistance. His theoretical studies of classical and Islamic military treatises provided insights into siege warfare that many experienced Crusader commanders lacked, enabling him to suggest tactical innovations that proved surprisingly effective against Saladin's increasingly sophisticated assault techniques. The diplomatic efforts to maintain alliances with the Byzantine Empire during this period required careful navigation of the complex relationships between Constantinople, the Crusader states, and various Islamic powers. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos maintained his own territorial ambitions in Anatolia and Syria that sometimes conflicted with Crusader interests. Yet Byzantine naval power and diplomatic connections provided essential counterweights to Saladin's expanding influence. Baldwin's administration, guided by Raymond III's diplomatic experience, worked to preserve Byzantine support while avoiding commitments that might compromise the kingdom's independence or draw it into conflicts that served imperial rather than Crusader strategic objectives. The relationship with Antioch and Tripoli presented additional diplomatic challenges as Saladin's power grew and his territorial ambitions expanded northward. Prince Bohemond III of Antioch faced his own pressures from Islamic forces based in Aleppo and northern Syria, while Raymond III of Tripoli needed to balance his duties as regent of Jerusalem with his responsibilities as ruler of his own county. These competing obligations created potential conflicts of interest that required careful management to maintain the coordination necessary for effective resistance to Saladin's expansion. Baldwin's personal involvement in diplomatic negotiations increased gradually as his understanding of regional politics deepened and his confidence in his abilities grew. The young king's facility with Arabic, developed during his education with William of Tyre, proved valuable in direct communications with Islamic rulers and in understanding intelligence reports from agents operating in Muslim territories. His knowledge of Islamic culture and religious practices, unusual among Crusader nobles, enabled him to appreciate the ideological dimensions of Saladin's appeal and develop counter-strategies that addressed both military and propaganda challenges. The military order's relationships with the crown during Baldwin's early reign reflected the complex balance between royal authority and institutional independence that characterized Crusader governance. The Knights Templar, under Grand Master Odo de Saint-Amand, maintained extensive fortifications along the kingdom's borders, while pursuing their own strategic objectives that sometimes conflicted with royal policies. The Hospitallers, led by Grand Master Roger de Moulins after 1177, controlled crucial territories in the north and maintained their own diplomatic relationships with neighbouring powers that could either support or undermine royal initiatives. Saladin's first major incursion into Crusader territory occurred in November 1177, when he led a substantial force northward from Egypt toward Ascalon, with apparent intentions of striking at Jerusalem itself. This expedition represented a significant escalation from his previous probing attacks, as intelligence reports indicated that Saladin had assembled approximately 26,000 troops, including regular infantry, cavalry units, and siege equipment necessary for assaulting fortified positions. The size and composition of this force suggested that the Kurdish commander felt sufficiently confident in his power base to risk a major confrontation with Crusader forces. Baldwin's response to this threat demonstrated both his growing military capabilities and his understanding of the kingdom's strategic limitations. Rather than attempting to match Saladin's numerical superiority through direct confrontation, the young king adopted a defensive strategy that utilized the kingdom's fortified positions and superior knowledge of local terrain to offset the enemy's advantages. The 16-year-old monarch personally supervised the concentration of available forces at strategic points while ensuring that essential fortifications remained adequately garrisoned to prevent Saladin from establishing permanent footholds in Crusader territory. The coordination of intelligence gathering during Saladin's 1177 campaign revealed Baldwin's appreciation for information warfare and his ability to utilize the kingdom's diverse population for strategic advantage. The young king's physical condition during this period showed continued deterioration that required increasingly sophisticated accommodation strategies. Baldwin's hands displayed visible signs of nerve damage that affected his ability to grip weapons or control horses with his previous dexterity, while facial lesions had begun to appear that required careful concealment during public appearances. However, his intellectual capabilities remained unimpaired, and his strategic thinking had developed to the point where experienced military commanders regularly sought his tactical insights and operational guidance. The logistical challenges of maintaining military readiness against Saladin's expanding power required innovative approaches to resource management that reflected both the kingdom's limitations and its unique advantages. Baldwin's administration developed supply systems that utilized the Italian Maritime Republic's commercial networks to secure necessary equipment and provisions while maintaining strategic reserves at key fortifications throughout the kingdom. These arrangements required careful diplomatic management to ensure that commercial relationships with European powers did not compromise military security or provide intelligence opportunities for Crusader enemies. The strategic situation facing Baldwin IV in November 1177 represented the most serious military challenge the Kingdom of Jerusalem had confronted since its establishment. Saladin's massive force of approximately 26,000 troops had advanced northward from Egypt with unprecedented coordination and tactical sophistication, moving through Gaza and establishing forward positions near Ascalon. Intelligence reports from Crusader scouts and local informants painted a disturbing picture of Islamic military organization that far exceeded anything the Fatimid Caliphate had previously deployed against Christian territories. Saladin's army composition reflected his systematic transformation of the Egyptian military capabilities over the preceding 3 years. The corps consisted of approximately 8,000 Kurdish and Turkish cavalry, professional soldiers whose equipment and training matched the finest military units anywhere in the Islamic world. These horsemen carried composite bows capable of accurate fire at ranges exceeding 200 yards, wore mail hauberks reinforced with iron plates, and rode Arabian horses bred specifically for endurance and speed in desert conditions. Supporting this elite cavalry were roughly 12,000 Arab tribal warriors drawn from Bedouin confederations throughout Egypt and Sinai. Fierce fighters whose knowledge of local terrain and traditional raiding tactics provided essential reconnaissance and harassment capabilities. The remaining 6,000 troops included Sudanese infantry armed with heavy spears and shields, Egyptian engineers trained in siege warfare techniques, and various support personnel responsible for maintaining the army's complex logistical requirements. This diverse force possessed linguistic and cultural connections throughout the region that enabled sophisticated intelligence gathering, while maintaining supply lines stretching back to the Nile Delta. Saladin's baggage train included siege engines, Greek fire apparatus, and sufficient provisions to sustain prolonged operations far from Egyptian bases. Baldwin's available military resources presented a stark contrast in both numbers and composition. The royal army could muster approximately 500 knights, accompanied by their squires and sergeants, bringing the total heavy cavalry to roughly 1,500 mounted warriors. These professional soldiers represented the military elite of Outremer, equipped with the finest armour and weapons available, yet their small numbers reflected the demographic limitations that had always constrained Crusader military capabilities. Supporting the knights were approximately 2,000 infantry troops, including crossbowmen, spearmen, and various support personnel drawn from the kingdom's urban populations and rural settlements. The military orders contributed additional forces that brought Baldwin's total strength to approximately 4,500 troops, still outnumbered by more than 5 to 1. The Knights Templar provided 300 brother knights, along with their associated sergeants and support personnel, while the Hospitallers contributed a similar number under Grand Master Roger de Moulins. These military orders brought not only additional manpower but also extensive experience in desert warfare and intimate knowledge of the tactical methods employed by Islamic armies in the region. Baldwin's strategic planning for confronting Saladin's invasion demonstrated remarkable tactical sophistication despite his youth and the physical limitations. Rather than attempting to defend static positions or engage in direct frontal assault, the 16-year-old king developed a mobile defense strategy that utilized the kingdom's superior knowledge of local terrain, while avoiding pitched battles that would favor Saladin's numerical superiority. This approach required precise coordination between multiple military units operating across extensive geographic areas, demanding communication systems and logistical support that tested the kingdom's administrative capabilities to their limits. The young king's decision to position his main force near Ramla reflected careful analysis of the strategic geography surrounding Jerusalem. This location provided access to multiple road networks that could facilitate rapid movement toward threatened positions while maintaining communication lines with the capital and other major fortifications. The terrain around Ramla offered defensive advantages, including elevated positions for archery and obstacles that could disrupt cavalry charges, yet remained sufficiently open to permit tactical flexibility if circumstances required repositioning or withdrawal. Baldwin's physical condition during the campaign required careful management to maintain both his personal effectiveness and the morale of troops who looked to their king for inspiration and leadership. The advancing leprosy had begun to affect his facial features in ways that careful observers could detect despite cosmetic concealment, while his hands showed visible signs of nerve damage that made gripping weapons or controlling horses increasingly difficult. However, the young king's intellectual capabilities remained sharp, and his strategic insights continued to impress veteran commanders who had initially questioned his military qualifications. The role of the True Cross in Crusader military operations extended far beyond mere ceremonial significance, representing a tangible connection to divine authority that provided essential psychological support for Christian forces facing overwhelming numerical odds. This sacred relic, believed to contain fragments of the actual cross on which Christ was crucified, had accompanied Crusader armies since the kingdom's establishment and had become associated with several important military victories. Its presence on the battlefield served to remind Christian warriors of their religious mission, while providing visible evidence of divine favour for their cause. Patriarch Heraclius of Jerusalem's decision to accompany the True Cross to the battlefield reflected both the religious significance of the confrontation and the political importance of demonstrating ecclesiastical support for Baldwin's leadership. The Patriarch's presence helped counter lingering theological concerns about divine favour for a leprous king while providing additional moral authority for the military campaign. Heraclius had been appointed to his position in 1180, but his involvement in the 1177 campaign established important precedents for church-state cooperation during military crises. The True Cross travelled in an elaborate reliquary designed to protect the sacred fragments while ensuring their visibility to Christian troops. This golden container, decorated with precious gems and religious imagery, was carried by specially selected clergy accompanied by armed guards responsible for its security. The relic's presence required specific protocols for its protection during combat operations, including designated retreat routes and defensive positions that could be activated if battlefield conditions threatened its safety. Saladin's tactical approach to the invasion demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of Crusader military capabilities and his confidence in his army's ability to achieve decisive victory through superior numbers and coordination. Rather than advancing directly toward Jerusalem through the most obvious route, the Kurdish commander chose to move northward along the coastal plain, threatening multiple Crusader positions while maintaining flexibility for tactical adjustments based on Christian defensive responses. This strategy aimed to force Baldwin into dividing his limited forces to protect multiple threatened locations, creating opportunities for Saladin to achieve local superiority and defeat Crusader units piecemeal. The Islamic army's advance through Crusader territory involved systematic reconnaissance and intelligence gathering that revealed Saladin's appreciation for the importance of accurate information in military operations. Kurdish and Arab scouts ranged far ahead of the main force, mapping defensive positions, identifying potential ambush sites, and gathering intelligence about Crusader troop movements and intentions. This intelligence network enabled Saladin to make informed tactical decisions while minimizing the risks associated with operating in unfamiliar territory against an enemy with superior local knowledge. Saladin's confidence in his military superiority led to tactical decisions that would ultimately prove decisive in determining the battle's outcome. Rather than maintaining tight formation and careful reconnaissance as his advance continued, the Kurdish commander allowed his forces to spread out in search of plunder and supplies, confident that Crusader forces lacked the strength to mount effective counterattacks. This dispersion reflected both the traditional raiding mentality of many of his Arab tribal allies and Saladin's assessment that Baldwin's small army posed no significant threat to his overwhelming numerical advantage. The intelligence network that provided Baldwin with detailed information about Saladin's movements and intentions represented one of the kingdom's most valuable strategic assets. Local Christian communities throughout the region maintained careful observation of Islamic military activities, transmitting information through established communication systems that reached royal commanders with remarkable speed and accuracy. Baldwin's decision to concentrate his forces for a decisive engagement, rather than pursuing a prolonged defensive campaign, reflected both strategic necessity and tactical opportunity. The kingdom's limited resources could not sustain extended military operations against such a large enemy force, while Saladin's dispersed formation created potential vulnerabilities that aggressive action might exploit. The young king's analysis of the tactical situation convinced him that bold action offered better prospects for success than cautious defensive measures that would ultimately favour the enemy's superior numbers. The concentration of Crusader forces near Montgisar on November 25, 1177, brought together military units that represented the full spectrum of the kingdom's defensive capabilities. The Royal Knights formed the core of the army, the heavy armour and powerful war horses providing the shock capability necessary for effective cavalry charges. The military orders contributed not only additional mounted warriors, but also tactical expertise gained through decades of combat experience against Islamic armies. Infantry units included crossbowmen whose mechanical weapons could penetrate Islamic armour at significant ranges, spearmen trained to resist cavalry charges, and various support troops responsible for maintaining equipment and communications. Baldwin's personal preparation for battle required careful attention to both his physical limitations and his symbolic importance as the army's leader. The young king wore specially modified armour that accommodated his reduced grip strength while providing maximum protection for his increasingly vulnerable extremities. His sword and other weapons received modifications that enabled him to maintain effective control despite his advancing leprosy, while his horse was selected for exceptional training and responsiveness to minimise the physical demands of mounted combat. The deployment of Crusader forces on the morning of November the 25th reflected Baldwin's sophisticated understanding of tactical principles and his ability to adapt classical military theories to contemporary battlefield conditions. The heavy cavalry formed the army's striking force, positioned to deliver maximum impact against enemy formations while maintaining sufficient flexibility to respond to changing tactical circumstances. Infantry units received positions that maximised their defensive capabilities while providing support for cavalry operations, with crossbowmen placed to deliver effective fire against enemy formations before and during the main engagement. Saladin's army approached the battlefield in a dispersed formation that reflected both overconfidence and tactical complacency. The Kurdish commander had divided his forces to facilitate foraging and reconnaissance, assuming that his overwhelming numerical superiority made concentrated formation unnecessary against such a small Crusader army. This dispersion created significant gaps in Islamic battle lines, while reducing the coordination between different military units that effective tactical response would require. The initial contact between opposing forces occurred during the early morning hours as Crusader reconnaissance units encountered Islamic advance guards, who had been conducting routine scouting operations. These preliminary skirmishes provided Baldwin with crucial intelligence about enemy positions and intentions, while alerting Saladin to the presence of a substantial Crusader force in his immediate vicinity. The Islamic commander's response to this intelligence revealed both tactical flexibility and strategic miscalculation, as he attempted to concentrate his dispersed units while maintaining offensive operations against multiple Crusader positions. Baldwin's decision to attack immediately upon establishing contact demonstrated both tactical boldness and strategic necessity. The young king recognized that Saladin's dispersed formation created a brief window of opportunity that would close rapidly as Islamic forces concentrated for coordinated defense. The element of surprise provided essential advantages that could partially offset the enormous numerical disparity between the opposing armies, while delay would allow Saladin to organize his superior forces for maximum tactical effectiveness. The charge of the Crusader heavy cavalry represented the culmination of decades of tactical development that had made these mounted warriors the most feared military force in the Eastern Mediterranean. The knights advanced in tight formation, their lances levelled and their war horses thundering across the battlefield in a display of disciplined power that had broken Islamic armies from Antioch to Ascalon. The psychological impact of this charge often proved as important as its physical effects, as the sight and sound of hundreds of armoured horsemen advancing at full speed could shatter enemy morale before actual contact occurred. Baldwin's personal participation in the cavalry charge required extraordinary courage, given his physical limitations and the obvious risks involved in close combat. The young king positioned himself in the front ranks of the attack, his presence serving to inspire Christian warriors, while demonstrating his commitment to sharing the dangers faced by his troops. His modified equipment and specially trained horse enabled him to maintain effective combat capability despite his advancing leprosy, though the physical demands of mounted warfare clearly strained his deteriorating condition. The impact of the Crusader charge against Saladin's hastily organised battle line achieved devastating results that exceeded even Baldwin's optimistic expectations. The Islamic forces, caught in the process of concentrating from their dispersed positions, lack the coordination necessary to resist the disciplined assault of heavy cavalry, supported by infantry and crossbow fire. The initial breakthrough created panic among Arab tribal units, who had never faced such concentrated military power, while even the professional Kurdish and Turkish cavalry found themselves unable to maintain formation against the sustained pressure of the Christian attack. The aftermath of Montgesar established Baldwin IV as a formidable military commander despite his physical affliction, yet the victory's political ramifications proved more complex than the tactical triumph itself. The 17-year-old king's leprosy had progressed significantly during the 18 months following his coronation, with visible lesions now appearing on his face and hands that required increasingly elaborate concealment strategies during public appearances. The characteristic thickening of facial features had begun to alter his appearance, while the progressive loss of sensation in his extremities made routine activities like writing, eating, and handling weapons more challenging with each passing month. William of Tyre's medical observations during this period provide detailed documentation of the disease's advancement through Baldwin's body. The Archbishop chronicler noted that the king's fingers had developed the characteristic claw-like deformity associated with advanced leprosy, as damaged nerves caused muscle atrophy and permanent contracture. Baldwin's feet showed similar deterioration, with ulcerations developing on pressure points where reduced sensation prevented him from detecting injury or irritation. The young king's voice had begun to show the hoarseness typical of laryngeal involvement, though his speech remained clear enough for normal communication and public addresses. The psychological impact of these physical changes on Baldwin's leadership style became increasingly apparent as he adapted his methods of governance to accommodate his limitations. The king developed sophisticated systems of written communication that relied heavily on trusted scribes and secretaries, as his deteriorating handwriting made personal correspondence increasingly difficult. Court ceremonies required careful choreography to minimize Baldwin's physical exposure, while maintaining the dignity essential for royal authority, with specially designed furniture and modified protocols that concealed his growing disabilities from casual observation. Baldwin's military leadership evolved during this period, from direct battlefield participation towards strategic oversight and tactical coordination. The king could no longer effectively wield weapons in personal combat, as his reduced grip strength and diminished manual dexterity made controlling swords, lances, or bows extremely difficult. His horsemanship suffered similarly, with balance problems and reduced leg strength requiring specially trained mounts and modified equipment to maintain his ability to ride. These limitations forced Baldwin to develop alternative methods of military command that emphasized intellectual rather than physical capabilities. The diplomatic challenges facing the kingdom during 1178 to 1180 reflected both Saladin's recovery from his defeat at Montgesar and the complex web of alliances that characterized Levantine politics. The Kurdish commander had retreated to Egypt following his catastrophic losses, but intelligence reports indicated systematic efforts to rebuild his military capabilities while expanding his political influence throughout the Islamic world. Saladin's correspondence with Nur ad-Din in Damascus revealed growing tensions between the nominal overlord and his increasingly independent subordinate, creating potential opportunities for Crusader diplomacy to exploit these divisions. Baldwin's approach to negotiations with Islamic rulers demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the religious and political factors that motivated his enemies. The king's facility with Arabic, developed during his education under William of Tyre, enabled him to engage directly with Muslim diplomats and understand the theological arguments underlying their territorial claims. His knowledge of Islamic law and custom, unusual among Crusader nobles, provided insights into negotiating positions that could appeal to Islamic concepts of justice, while protecting essential Crusader interests. The truce negotiations that began in late 1178 revealed the complex calculations underlying medieval diplomatic practice. Saladin proposed a 2-year cessation of hostilities that would allow both sides to consolidate their positions while addressing internal political challenges. For the Islamic commander, this respite provided essential time to complete his reorganization of Egyptian military forces while managing his increasingly strained relationship with Nur ad-Din. Baldwin recognized that the kingdom's limited manpower and financial resources made prolonged warfare unsustainable, yet he understood that any truce must include provisions protecting Crusader commercial interests and territorial integrity. The prisoner exchange agreements negotiated during this period demonstrated both the humanitarian concerns and practical calculations that influenced medieval warfare. Hundreds of knights, sergeants and infantry soldiers captured during various skirmishes and raids awaited ransom or exchange in dungeons throughout Egypt and Syria. The complex negotiations required detailed assessments of individual prisoners' value, consideration of their families' ability to pay ransoms, and careful attention to the political implications of releasing particular individuals who might possess sensitive intelligence or military expertise. Baldwin's personal involvement in these negotiations extended beyond mere royal approval to detailed participation in determining exchange rates, evaluating prisoner claims, and coordinating the complex logistics required for transferring individuals across hostile territory. The king's reputation for honouring agreements and treating prisoners humanely, established during his brief reign, provided essential credibility for these diplomatic initiatives. Islamic sources from this period acknowledge Baldwin's personal integrity in diplomatic matters, noting his scrupulous adherence to negotiated terms even when circumstances might have justified violations. The territorial agreements emerging from these diplomatic exchanges reflected the military realities established by Montgisart while acknowledging the continuing threat posed by Saladin's expanding power. The Kingdom of Jerusalem retained control over its core territories, including the coastal cities, the Jordan Valley, and the crucial fortifications controlling trade routes between Egypt and Syria. However, Baldwin accepted limitations on Crusader expansion southward, while agreeing to respect certain Islamic commercial privileges that generated revenue for Saladin's administration. The internal political tensions that characterized Baldwin's court during this period stemmed partly from disagreements over diplomatic strategy and partly from the growing influence of competing factions with different visions for the kingdom's future. The court party, centered around families like the Ibelins who had risen through royal service, generally supported Baldwin's pragmatic approach to Islamic relations and his willingness to negotiate truces when military circumstances warranted such agreements. This faction understood that the kingdom's survival depended on careful management of its limited resources and strategic flexibility in responding to changing circumstances. The military party, led by figures like Reynald of Châtillon and supported by elements within the military orders, advocated for more aggressive policies that would maintain constant pressure on Islamic territories while rejecting any negotiations that might be interpreted as signs of weakness. This faction argued that Crusader military superiority, demonstrated at Montgisart, provided opportunities for territorial expansion that diplomatic accommodation would waste. Their influence grew during periods when military successes seemed to validate aggressive approaches, yet their policies required military and financial commitments that strained the kingdom's limited capabilities. The marriage politics surrounding Baldwin's sister Sibylla became increasingly central to court intrigue as the king's advancing leprosy raised questions about royal succession. Sibylla's first marriage to William of Montferrat in 1176 had produced a son, but William's death in 1177 left the princess as a widow whose remarriage would have profound implications for the kingdom's political future. Various European nobles sought her hand as a means of establishing claims to eventual succession. while different court factions promoted candidates who would support their particular political agendas. Agnes of Courtenay, Baldwin's mother, emerged as a powerful force in these succession discussions, leveraging her extensive network of relationships within the Jerusalem court to influence marriage negotiations. Her previous conflicts with Raymond III of Tripoli created additional complications, as the regent's opposition to Agnes's political influence extended to his preferences regarding Sibylla's remarriage. These personal animosities became entangled with broader questions of royal policy and succession planning that would have lasting consequences for the kingdom's stability. The question of Baldwin's own marriage presented even more complex challenges, as his leprosy made traditional dynastic alliances extremely difficult to negotiate. European noble families showed understandable reluctance to commit their daughters to marriage with a leprous king, regardless of the political advantages such unions might offer. The theological implications of a leprous ruler producing heirs created additional complications, as questions about divine favour and hereditary taint could potentially undermine the legitimacy of any children born from such marriages. Baldwin's administrative innovations during this period demonstrated his continued intellectual capacity despite his physical deterioration. The king implemented new systems of record-keeping that improved the efficiency of royal administration, while creating better documentation of legal proceedings, financial transactions, and diplomatic agreements. These innovations reflected both practical necessity, as Baldwin's physical limitations required delegation of routine administrative tasks, and intellectual sophistication that enabled him to design improved governmental procedures. The legal reforms introduced during Baldwin's reign addressed long-standing problems within the kingdom's complex jurisdictional system. The Crusader states had inherited a mixture of European feudal law, Byzantine legal traditions, and local customs that created frequent conflicts over jurisdiction and procedure. Baldwin's legal scholars, working under royal direction, produced clarifications and codifications that reduced these conflicts while preserving the essential features of feudal governance that maintained noble support for royal authority. The commercial regulations implemented during this period reflected Baldwin's understanding of the kingdom's dependence on trade revenues and his recognition of the changing economic conditions that affected Levantine commerce. The Italian maritime republics required careful management to maintain their support for Crusader territories, while preventing their commercial interests from compromising military security. Baldwin's policies balanced the need for commercial revenue against security concerns, establishing procedures that facilitated trade while maintaining royal control over strategic resources and information. The military reforms undertaken during Baldwin's reign addressed the kingdom's chronic manpower shortages while adapting to the changing tactical environment created by Islamic military innovations. The king expanded the role of crossbow units, recognizing that these weapons provided infantry forces with capabilities that could partially offset the advantages of Islamic cavalry. The systematic training of crossbowmen required significant financial investment in equipment and instruction, but the results proved valuable in subsequent military engagements where disciplined archery disrupted enemy formations and provided essential fire support for cavalry operations. Baldwin's approach to fortification strategy during this period emphasized the maintenance and improvement of existing strongholds rather than the construction of new castles that would strain available resources. The great fortifications of Queyrac, Montreal and Belvoir received systematic upgrades that incorporated lessons learned from recent sieges and reflected contemporary developments in military engineering. These improvements included enhanced water storage systems, improved artillery positions, and expanded living quarters that enabled garrisons to withstand prolonged sieges while maintaining combat effectiveness. The intelligence networks developed during Baldwin's reign provided essential information about Islamic military preparations and political developments throughout the region. The king's administration cultivated relationships with merchants, pilgrims, and religious minorities who possessed access to information about enemy activities and intentions. These intelligence sources required careful management to protect their security while maximizing the value of their reports, demanding sophisticated coordination between royal officials and field operatives operating throughout hostile territory. The financial challenges facing the kingdom during this period required innovative approaches to revenue generation and resource management. Baldwin's treasury officials developed new taxation systems that increased royal revenues while minimizing the burden on productive economic activities. The careful balance between military expenditures and economic development reflected the king's understanding that long-term survival required both military strength and economic prosperity that could sustain defensive efforts over extended periods. The ecclesiastical relations during Baldwin's reign required delicate navigation of the complex relationships between Latin and Eastern Christian churches, the political ambitions of various religious orders, and the diplomatic connections between local religious authorities and Rome. The king's leprosy continued to generate theological debates about divine favour and royal legitimacy, requiring careful management of clerical opinion through both intellectual argument and practical demonstration of effective governance. The marriage of Sibylla to Guy de Lusignan in April 1180 sent shockwaves through the political establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem that reverberated far beyond the immediate concerns of royal succession. Guy, a younger son from Poitou who had arrived in the east seeking fortune and advancement, possessed neither the extensive territorial holdings nor the established military reputation that the kingdom's nobility expected from a potential king. His elevation through marriage to the heir presumptive represented a dramatic departure from traditional patterns of crusader politics, where marriages typically served to cement alliances between established noble families or secure connections with the European powers. Agnes of Courtenay orchestrated this controversial union with calculated precision, recognizing that Gay's relative weakness and dependence on royal favour would make him a malleable ally in her ongoing political struggles with Raymond III of Tripoli. The Queen Mother's influence over Baldwin had grown substantially during his illness periods, when his physical condition required extended periods of rest and reduced public activity. During these intervals, Agnes effectively controlled access to the king while building networks of support among court officials, minor nobles, and ecclesiastical figures who owed their positions to royal patronage. The political ramifications of Sibylla's marriage extended throughout the complex web of relationships that bound the Crusader nobility together. Raymond III of Tripoli, who had served as regent during Baldwin's minority and expected to maintain significant influence over succession planning, found himself systematically excluded from the marriage negotiations. His opposition to Guy de Lusignan stemmed not merely from personal animosity but from genuine concerns about the Poitevin noble's qualifications for eventual kingship. Raymond's extensive experience governing Tripoli and his intimate knowledge of Levantine politics convinced him that Guy lacked both the diplomatic sophistication and military expertise necessary to defend the kingdom against Saladin's expanding power. The Ibelin family, led by Balian of Ibelin and his brother Baldwin, represented the most formidable opposition to Guy's elevation within the court party itself. These established nobles had built their influence through generations of loyal service to previous kings and possessed extensive territorial holdings that provided independent power bases. Their opposition to Guy reflected both personal ambition and principled concerns about governance, as they questioned whether a relative newcomer could command the respect necessary to maintain feudal obligations and coordinate military campaigns effectively. Guy de Lusignan's background and character presented both advantages and liabilities for his new role as heir presumptive to the Jerusalem throne. His military experience included service in the ongoing conflicts between the Plantagenet and Capetian monarchies in France, where he had demonstrated competence in conventional European warfare, but lacked exposure to the unique tactical challenges of Levantine combat. His administrative experience remained limited to managing relatively small territorial holdings in Poitou, providing little preparation for governing a kingdom that encompassed diverse populations, complex commercial relationships, and constant military pressures. The new prince consort's personality traits became subjects of intense scrutiny as nobles evaluated his fitness for eventual kingship. Contemporary sources describe Guy as physically impressive, with the tall stature and martial bearing expected of medieval nobility, yet they also note his tendency toward indecision when facing complex political situations. His religious devotion appeared genuine but conventional, lacking the theological sophistication that had characterized previous Crusader rulers who needed to navigate the complex ecclesiastical politics of the Holy Land. Baldwin's deteriorating health during 1180 to 1181 created increasingly frequent periods when royal authority effectively passed to regents and advisors, generating power struggles that reflected the deeper divisions within the kingdom's political structure. The king's leprosy had progressed to the point where his hands could barely grip writing instruments, requiring him to rely entirely on scribes for official correspondence. His facial disfigurement had become severe enough that public appearances required careful staging and limited duration to maintain the dignity essential for royal authority. The physical manifestations of Baldwin's advancing disease created practical challenges that extended beyond mere ceremonial concerns into the realm of actual governance. The king's voice had become increasingly hoarse and weak, making it difficult for him to address large assemblies or conduct extended negotiations. His mobility was severely compromised, with walking becoming painful and riding requiring special equipment and assistance. These limitations forced the development of new protocols for royal administration that distributed authority among trusted officials while maintaining the fiction of direct royal control. Raymond III's role during Baldwin's illness periods demonstrated both his administrative competence and his growing frustration with the political changes occurring within the kingdom. The Count of Tripoli possessed extensive experience managing the complex relationships between Crusader states, Islamic neighbours, and European powers that characterized Levantine diplomacy. His pragmatic approach to governance emphasized negotiation and compromise when military solutions proved impractical, reflecting lessons learned through decades of frontier warfare and political maneuvering. The tensions between Raymond and Guy de Lusignan intensified as Baldwin's condition worsened, and questions of immediate succession became more pressing. Raymond viewed Guy as fundamentally unprepared for the challenges of ruling the Kingdom of Jerusalem, lacking both the diplomatic experience necessary to maintain crucial alliances and the military expertise required to coordinate defense against Islamic reconquest efforts. These concerns extended beyond personal ambition to encompass genuine fears about the kingdom's survival under inexperienced leadership. Guy's supporters within the court developed arguments defending his qualifications while attacking Raymond's fitness for continued influence over royal policy. They emphasized Guy's youth and vigour as advantages over Raymond's advancing age, arguing that energetic leadership was essential for confronting Saladin's expanding power. His European connections provided potential sources of military and financial support that could supplement the kingdom's limited indigenous resources, while his lack of established enemies within the Crusader nobility offered opportunities for building new coalitions unencumbered by historical grievances. The military challenges facing the kingdom during this period required coordinated responses that the political divisions within the court made increasingly difficult to achieve. Saladin had used the respite following Montgesar to systematically rebuild his military capabilities while expanding his territorial control throughout Egypt and southern Syria. Intelligence reports described new training programs for Islamic cavalry units, improved siege equipment, and expanded recruitment efforts that suggested preparation for renewed major campaigns against Crusader territories. Baldwin's nephew, the young Baldwin V, born to Sibylla and her first husband William of Montferrat, represented a potential solution to the succession crisis that could satisfy competing factions within the nobility. The child possessed unquestionable legitimacy through his descent from Baldwin III and his position as heir to his uncle's throne, while his youth provided opportunities for regency arrangements that could balance different political interests. However, the boy's tender age also created vulnerabilities, as effective governance would require stable regency arrangements that the kingdom's political divisions made difficult to establish and maintain. The legal complexities surrounding succession arrangements reflected the unique constitutional structure of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, where the High Court of Nobles possessed significant influence over royal succession, while feudal law provided frameworks for regency and guardianship. Baldwin IV's efforts to secure his nephew's eventual succession required careful negotiation with various noble factions, each seeking to maximize their influence over future regency arrangements, while protecting their existing territorial and political interests. The defense of Kerak in 1183 provided a crucial test of the kingdom's military capabilities and political coordination under the strains created by succession uncertainties. Reynald of Chatillon's aggressive policies had provoked Saladin into launching a major siege against this crucial fortress, which controlled the vital trade routes connecting Egypt and Syria. The castle's strategic position made its defence essential for maintaining Crusader territorial integrity, yet the political divisions within the kingdom complicated efforts to organise effective relief operations. Baldwin's personal involvement in the Kerak campaign demonstrated both his continued military acumen and the severe physical limitations imposed by his advancing leprosy. The king could no longer participate directly in combat operations, as his deteriorating condition made riding and weapon handling extremely difficult. However, his strategic insights and tactical planning remained sharp, enabling him to coordinate the complex maneuvers required to break Saladin's siege while minimizing casualties among the kingdom's limited military forces. The Siege of Kerak revealed Saladin's improved military capabilities and his systematic approach to reducing Crusader strongholds through sustained pressure rather than costly direct assaults. The Islamic commander had assembled approximately 20,000 troops, including professional siege engineers, artillery specialists, and sufficient supplies to maintain operations for extended periods. His tactical approach emphasized cutting off the fortress's communications and supply lines while using advanced siege equipment to systematically breach its fortifications. The coordination of relief efforts for Kerak required Baldwin to overcome the political divisions that had paralysed court decision-making in other contexts. The king successfully assembled a relief force that included contingents from the military orders, royal forces, and noble retinues despite the ongoing tensions between Raymond III and Guy de Lusignan. This temporary unity reflected the recognition that Kerak's fall would have catastrophic strategic implications that transcended immediate political rivalries. The tactical innovations employed during the Kerak relief campaign demonstrated Baldwin's continued evolution as a military commander despite his physical limitations. Rather than attempting direct confrontation with Saladin's numerically superior forces, the king developed a strategy that utilized multiple coordinated attacks to force the Islamic commander to divide his attention and resources. This approach maximized the effectiveness of limited Crusader forces while minimizing the risks associated with pitched battles against overwhelming odds. The successful relief of Kerak provided temporary respite from immediate military pressures while highlighting the kingdom's continued vulnerability to sustained Islamic pressure. Saladin's withdrawal following the arrival of Crusader relief forces reflected tactical calculation rather than strategic abandonment of his objectives, as intelligence reports indicated continued preparations for future campaigns against other Crusader strongholds. The Islamic commander's systematic approach to territorial conquest suggested that the Kingdom of Jerusalem, faced prolonged pressure that would test both its military capabilities and political cohesion. The aftermath of Kerak intensified discussions about succession arrangements, as Baldwin's visible deterioration during the campaign convinced many observers that his reign was entering its final phase. The king's public appearances during the relief operations revealed the advanced state of his leprosy, with facial disfigurement and physical weakness that could no longer be concealed through careful staging and ceremonial arrangements. These developments created urgency around establishing clear succession procedures that could prevent civil conflict during the vulnerable transition period. The competing claims and interests surrounding young Baldwin V's eventual succession created complex negotiations that involved not only the immediate royal family, but also the broader network of noble families whose support would be essential for effective governance. Raymond III's position as the child's great-uncle provided legal grounds for claiming regency rights, while Guy de Lusignan's marriage to Sibylla created alternative claims based on his role as the boy's stepfather and potential future king in his own right. The military order's positions regarding succession arrangements reflected their institutional interests in maintaining stability and effectiveness in the ongoing struggle against Islamic reconquest efforts. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers possessed independent resources and international connections that made their support crucial for any successful reign, yet their sometimes competing priorities and fierce institutional independence created additional complications in succession planning. Their evaluation of different candidates focused primarily on military competence and commitment to aggressive defence of Crusader territories. The diplomatic implications of succession uncertainties extended beyond the kingdom's borders to encompass relationships with the Byzantine Empire, various European powers, and even certain Islamic rulers who maintained commercial or political interests in regional stability. The perception of weakness or division within the Kingdom of Jerusalem could encourage opportunistic attacks while undermining the diplomatic relationships that provided essential support for Crusader survival in the hostile environment of the Eastern Mediterranean. The political machinations surrounding young Baldwin V's recognition as heir apparent reached their climax in November 1183, when the 22-year-old leprous king summoned the High Court of Jerusalem to formally address the succession crisis that had paralysed effective governance for months. Baldwin IV's physical condition had deteriorated to such an extent that his public appearances required elaborate staging to maintain royal dignity, with specially constructed chairs that concealed his inability to stand for extended periods and carefully positioned lighting that minimised the visibility of his facial disfigurement. The king's hands, now severely contracted from nerve damage, could barely manage the ceremonial gestures required for formal court proceedings, necessitating the assistance of trusted attendants who helped manipulate documents and regalia during official ceremonies. The assembly that gathered in Jerusalem's royal palace represented the full spectrum of Crusader nobility, yet the underlying tensions between competing factions created an atmosphere of barely controlled hostility that threatened to erupt into open conflict. Raymond III of Tripoli arrived with a substantial retinue that included several prominent barons from his county, their presence serving as both a show of strength and a subtle reminder of his independent power base. Guy de Lusignan, accompanied by his supporters from the court party, occupied positions that emphasised his role as Sibylla's husband and potential regent for young Baldwin V. The military orders maintained their characteristic independence, with Grand Master Arnold de Torroja of the Templars and Grand Master Roger de Moulins of the Hospitallers, carefully positioning themselves to avoid appearing to favour either faction while preserving their institution's interests in political stability. Baldwin's opening address to the assembled nobles demonstrated the intellectual acuity that remained unimpaired despite his physical deterioration. Speaking in a voice that had become increasingly hoarse and strained, the king outlined his vision for a regency arrangement that would balance competing interests while ensuring effective governance during his nephew's minority. The proposed structure would formally recognise young Baldwin V as heir apparent while establishing Raymond III as regent, a compromise that acknowledged both the child's legitimate claim and Raymond's extensive administrative experience. However, this arrangement included provisions that would transfer regency authority to the boy's mother, Sibylla, when he reached the age of 10, creating a pathway for Guy de Lusignan to eventually assume power through his wife's influence. The negotiations surrounding these succession arrangements revealed the complex calculations underlying medieval political decision-making, as each faction evaluated the proposed terms against their immediate interests and long-term strategic objectives. Raymond III's acceptance of the regency role reflected his recognition that direct opposition to the legitimate succession would undermine his own position, while potentially creating opportunities for his enemies to portray him as a usurper. The Count of Tripoli understood that effective regency would require cooperation from other noble families, making it essential to maintain at least the appearance of consensus around succession arrangements. Guy de Lusignan's acquiescence to the regency proposal demonstrated political sophistication that surprised many observers who had dismissed him as a mere court favourite lacking strategic vision. The Poitevin noble recognised that immediate assumption of royal authority would face overwhelming opposition from established noble families, while the proposed arrangement provided a legitimate pathway to eventual power that could be pursued through patient political manoeuvring. His supporters within the court party viewed the succession agreement as a tactical retreat that preserved their long-term objectives while avoiding immediate confrontation with more powerful opponents. The coronation of young Baldwin V on November 20th, 1183, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, represented both a triumph of political compromise and a sobering reminder of the kingdom's precarious situation. The 5-year-old child, carried to the altar by his great-uncle Raymond III, possessed the physical perfection that medieval kingship required, yet lacked any understanding of the complex responsibilities his position entailed. The ceremony itself required careful choreography to accommodate Baldwin IV's physical limitations, while maintaining the dignity essential for royal legitimacy, with the leprous king managing to place the crown on his nephew's head despite the visible trembling of his contracted hands. The immediate aftermath of the coronation created new dynamics within the kingdom's political structure, as Raymond III assumed the practical responsibilities of governance, while Baldwin IV retained theoretical authority as the reigning monarch. This dual authority system generated inevitable tensions over policy decisions and administrative appointments, with different factions attempting to influence both rulers according to their particular interests. The arrangement required constant negotiation and compromise to prevent open conflict between the regent and the king, whose deteriorating condition made sustained political engagement increasingly difficult. Saladin's response to the succession arrangements in Jerusalem reflected his sophisticated understanding of Crusader political dynamics and his recognition that internal divisions created opportunities for Islamic territorial expansion. Intelligence reports from the Kurdish commander's court in Cairo indicated systematic preparations for renewed military campaigns that would exploit the kingdom's political uncertainties while testing the effectiveness of the new regency government. The Islamic leader's correspondence with subordinate commanders revealed plans for coordinated attacks against multiple Crusader positions, designed to prevent effective concentration of defensive forces while maximising pressure on the kingdom's overstretched military resources. The strategic situation facing the Kingdom of Jerusalem in early 1184 presented challenges that exceeded even those confronted during Saladin's previous major campaigns. The Islamic commander had spent the intervening months since the Kerak siege systematically expanding his territorial control throughout southern Syria while strengthening his administrative apparatus in Egypt. His military forces had grown to approximately 30,000 professional troops, supplemented by tribal auxiliaries and volunteer fighters, drawn from throughout the Islamic world by appeals to religious duty and promises of plunder from successful campaigns against Christian territories. Baldwin IV's final major military campaign began in March 1184, when intelligence reports indicated that Saladin was concentrating substantial forces near Damascus in preparation for a coordinated assault against the kingdom's northern territories. The leprous king's decision to personally lead the defensive response demonstrated both his continued commitment to royal duties and his recognition that visible royal leadership was essential for maintaining morale among troops who faced overwhelming numerical odds. The physical challenges of campaign leadership for a ruler whose condition had advanced to near complete incapacitation required unprecedented accommodations that tested the loyalty and ingenuity of his closest supporters. The military preparations for this campaign revealed the extent to which Baldwin's physical limitations had transformed traditional patterns of royal command. The king travelled in a specially constructed litter that provided protection from the elements while enabling him to observe battlefield conditions and communicate with subordinate commanders. His inability to wear traditional armour or carry weapons required the constant presence of bodyguards, whose responsibilities extended beyond mere protection to include assistance with basic physical needs that his condition made impossible to manage independently. The concentration of Crusader forces near Safed in April 1184 brought together approximately 8,000 troops representing the kingdom's maximum available military strength. This force included 1,200 knights, accompanied by their squires and sergeants, 2,500 infantry soldiers drawn from urban militias and rural settlements, and 1,800 troops contributed by the military orders. The remaining forces consisted of crossbowmen, engineers, and various support personnel, whose specialised skills were essential for effective military operations in the challenging terrain of northern Palestine and southern Lebanon. Baldwin's tactical planning for the campaign demonstrated the strategic insights that had characterised his military leadership throughout his reign, adapted to accommodate his physical limitations while maximising the effectiveness of limited Crusader resources. Rather than seeking decisive battle against Saladin's superior numbers, the king developed a defensive strategy that utilised the kingdom's network of fortifications to channel enemy movements while creating opportunities for concentrated attacks against isolated Islamic units. This approach required precise coordination between multiple military commanders operating across extensive geographic areas, demanding communication systems and logistical support that tested the kingdom's administrative capabilities. The siege of Kerak Castle in August 1184 provided the most dramatic demonstration of Baldwin's continued military effectiveness, despite his advanced leprosy. Saladin had returned to this strategic fortress with an even larger force than his previous attempt, recognising that its capture would effectively cut the Kingdom of Jerusalem in half, while providing a secure base for future operations against other Crusader strongholds. The Islamic commander's siege preparations included advanced artillery equipment, professional engineers, and sufficient supplies to sustain operations for several months if necessary. Reynaud of Chatillon's defence of Kerak revealed both his military capabilities and his understanding of the political implications that the fortress's fall would create for the entire kingdom. The controversial Lord of Ultrajordan had used the intervening period since Saladin's previous siege to strengthen the castle's fortifications while expanding its garrison and supply reserves. His preparations included the construction of additional defensive works, the installation of improved artillery positions, and the development of communication systems that could maintain contact with potential relief forces despite enemy attempts at blockade. Baldwin's approach to organising relief for Kerak required extraordinary political skill to overcome the factional divisions that continued to plague the kingdom's nobility. The king successfully assembled a relief force that included contingents from rival political factions, demonstrating his continued ability to inspire cooperation when military necessity demanded unified action. The coordination of this relief effort required complex negotiations with Raymond III, Guy de Lusignan, and various independent nobles whose support was essential, but whose mutual animosities threatened to undermine effective military cooperation. The march toward Kerak in September 1184 presented Baldwin with the most severe physical challenges of his entire military career. The king's condition had deteriorated to the point where mounting a horse required assistance from multiple attendants, while his ability to remain in the saddle for extended periods was severely compromised by balance problems and chronic pain. The campaign's physical demands forced the development of innovative solutions that enabled royal participation, while acknowledging the practical limitations imposed by advanced leprosy. The relief column's approach to Kerak revealed Saladin's tactical sophistication and his recognition that direct confrontation with Crusader heavy cavalry remained problematic despite his numerical advantages. The Islamic commander had positioned his forces to maximize defensive advantages while maintaining flexibility for tactical adjustments based on Crusader movements and intentions. His deployment included advance guards responsible for reconnaissance and harassment operations, main battle formations positioned to resist cavalry charges, and reserve units that could respond to unexpected developments or exploit tactical opportunities. Baldwin's final battlefield command occurred during the preliminary skirmishes that preceded the main engagement, as Crusader advance units encountered Islamic forces positioned to block access to the besieged fortress. The king's physical presence, despite his obvious disabilities, provided essential moral support for Christian troops who faced daunting numerical odds while operating far from their home bases. His tactical guidance, communicated through a network of messengers and signal systems, demonstrated the strategic acumen that had characterized his military leadership throughout his reign. The successful relief of Kerak in October 1184 represented both a tactical victory and a strategic warning about the kingdom's long-term prospects. Saladin's withdrawal following the arrival of Crusader relief forces reflected calculated assessment of tactical risks rather than abandonment of his territorial objectives. The Islamic commander's systematic approach to siege warfare and his ability to maintain large armies in the field for extended periods suggested that future campaigns would present even greater challenges for the kingdom's overstretched defensive capabilities. The political ramifications of the Kerak campaign extended beyond immediate military concerns to encompass fundamental questions about governance and succession that Baldwin's deteriorating condition made increasingly urgent. The king's visible struggle to maintain basic physical functions during the relief operations convinced many observers that his active reign was approaching its end, creating pressure for final resolution of succession arrangements and regency procedures. The successful coordination of the relief effort demonstrated that effective military leadership remained possible despite political divisions, yet it also highlighted the extraordinary circumstances required to achieve such cooperation. Baldwin's return to Jerusalem following the Kerak campaign marked the beginning of his final transition from active ruler to ceremonial monarch, whose authority increasingly passed to regents and advisors. The physical toll of the military operations had accelerated his condition's progression, with new symptoms appearing that made even basic court functions extremely challenging. His hands had become so contracted that signing documents required assistance, while his facial disfigurement had progressed to the point where public appearances became increasingly rare and carefully staged to minimize shock among observers. The administrative arrangements implemented during Baldwin's final months reflected both the practical necessities created by his condition and the political requirements for maintaining royal authority during a vulnerable transition period. Raymond III assumed increasing responsibility for day-to-day governance while consulting with the king on major policy decisions, creating a collaborative system that preserved theoretical royal authority while ensuring effective administration. This arrangement required constant negotiation and compromise to prevent conflicts between the regent's practical authority and the king's ceremonial position. The diplomatic initiatives undertaken during Baldwin's final active period demonstrated his continued commitment to securing the kingdom's position through negotiation and alliance building, rather than relying solely on military solutions. The king's correspondence with European rulers included detailed requests for military and financial assistance, emphasizing both the strategic importance of the Crusader states and the immediate threats posed by Saladin's expanding power. These diplomatic efforts required sophisticated understanding of European political dynamics and careful attention to the particular interests and concerns of different potential allies. The preparations for transferring authority to young Baldwin V accelerated during late 1184, as the leprous king's condition made it increasingly clear that his active reign was approaching its end. The complex legal and political arrangements required for this transition involved detailed negotiations with various noble factions, ecclesiastical authorities, and the military orders whose support would be essential for the child king's eventual success. These preparations required extraordinary attention to constitutional procedures and political sensitivities that could affect the kingdom's stability during the vulnerable succession period. The winter months of 1184 to 1185 witnessed Baldwin IV's final transformation from an active monarch to a living symbol whose mere presence had become more important than his capacity for direct governance. The 23-year-old king's leprosy had progressed to such an advanced stage that his facial features had become severely distorted, with the characteristic leonine appearance that gave the disease its medieval name. His nose had begun to collapse inward, creating the sunken facial structure that marked the final stages of the condition, while his eyebrows had thickened grotesquely and his lips had become swollen and cracked. Most significantly for his ability to function as a ruler, Baldwin had lost virtually all vision in both eyes, with the corneal damage typical of advanced leprosy rendering him effectively blind. The king's hands had become completely unusable for any practical purpose, contracted into permanent claw-like positions that made grasping objects impossible. The nerve damage had progressed throughout his arms, leaving him unable to feed himself or perform basic personal care without constant assistance. His feet had suffered similar deterioration, with multiple ulcerations that refused to heal and had become chronically infected despite the best medical attention available in the kingdom. Walking had become impossible without support, and even sitting upright for extended periods caused visible distress that court officials worked desperately to conceal from visiting dignitaries and potential enemies who might interpret such weakness as opportunity. The practical arrangements for maintaining royal authority under these circumstances required unprecedented innovation in medieval governmental procedures. Baldwin's trusted secretary, a learned cleric named Peter, who had served the royal household for over a decade, became the king's primary means of communication with the outside world. Peter had developed an intimate understanding of Baldwin's increasingly indistinct speech patterns, enabling him to interpret the king's wishes and translate them into formal royal commands. This arrangement required absolute discretion and loyalty, as Peter effectively controlled access to royal authority while maintaining the fiction that decisions originated directly from the king himself. The physical environment of the royal palace underwent substantial modifications to accommodate Baldwin's condition, while preserving the dignity essential for effective kingship. The king's private chambers were redesigned with specially constructed furniture that provided support for his deteriorating body, while enabling him to receive visitors and conduct necessary business. Heavy curtains and carefully positioned oil lamps created lighting conditions that minimized the visibility of his disfigurement while allowing him to perceive shapes and movements despite his near-total blindness. The floors were covered with thick carpets that muffled sounds and provided cushioning in case of falls, while servants maintained constant vigilance to prevent accidents that could prove fatal given his compromised immune system. Raymond III of Tripoli's role as regent during this final period required extraordinary political skill to maintain governmental continuity, while managing the competing factions that continued to vie for influence over the eventual succession. The Count of Tripoli had established regular consultations with Baldwin, despite the king's communication difficulties, recognising that visible royal approval remained essential for legitimising major policy decisions. These meetings typically occurred in the early morning hours when Baldwin's condition was most stable, with discussions limited to the most crucial matters requiring immediate royal attention. The question of young Baldwin V's education and preparation for eventual rule became increasingly urgent, as his great-uncle's condition deteriorated. The 6-year-old prince had been placed under the tutelage of carefully selected clerics and nobles who understood the unique challenges he would face as king of a threatened kingdom. His curriculum emphasized practical statecraft and military strategy, rather than the classical education typical for medieval royalty, reflecting the recognition that his reign would likely begin during a period of active warfare against Saladin's expanding power. The boy showed remarkable intelligence and maturity for his age, yet his youth remained a source of concern for nobles, who understood that effective leadership would be essential during the coming struggles. The formal arrangements for transferring authority to Baldwin V required complex negotiations that occupied much of Raymond III's attention during the winter months. The High Court needed to establish clear procedures for the transition that would minimise opportunities for political disruption, while ensuring that the child king received adequate protection and guidance. These discussions involved detailed consideration of guardianship arrangements, regency powers, and the mechanisms by which royal authority would eventually pass from the regent to the young king himself when he reached maturity. Sibylla's position during these negotiations remained complicated by her marriage to Guy de Lusignan and the competing claims this relationship created regarding her son's future regency. Guy's supporters argued that his role as the boy's stepfather provided natural authority for eventual guardianship, while Raymond III and his allies maintained that the Count of Tripoli's blood relationship and extensive governmental experience made him the more suitable choice for protecting the kingdom's interests during the vulnerable minority period. These debates reflected deeper disagreements about the kingdom's future direction and the policies necessary for survival against Islamic reconquest efforts. The military situation during Baldwin's final months presented challenges that tested the kingdom's defensive capabilities to their limits. Intelligence reports from throughout the region indicated that Saladin was using the winter respite to conduct systematic preparations for what appeared to be a comprehensive campaign aimed at eliminating Crusader presence in the Levant. The Kurdish commander had established training camps in Egypt where new recruits learned advanced siege techniques, while his diplomatic efforts had secured support from Islamic rulers throughout the Middle East, who viewed the destruction of the Crusader states as a religious obligation. Saladin's administrative innovations during this period demonstrated his understanding that military conquest required solid governmental foundations to ensure lasting success. The Kurdish commander had implemented new taxation systems throughout his territories that generated substantial revenues for military expenditures while maintaining popular support through careful attention to Islamic legal principles and local customs. His court in Cairo had become a centre of Islamic learning and culture that attracted scholars and administrators from throughout the Muslim world, creating an intellectual environment that supported his claims to leadership of the broader Islamic community. The fortification program undertaken during Baldwin's final year reflected both the kingdom's strategic priorities and its recognition of the limited time available for defensive preparations. The great castles of Kerak and Montreal received substantial reinforcements, including additional artillery positions, expanded water storage systems, and improved living quarters for extended siege conditions. The coastal fortifications at Acre, Tyre, and other major ports were strengthened to ensure continued communication with European allies and suppliers, while the inland fortresses controlling key mountain passes received enhanced garrisons and supply reserves. Baldwin's legal initiatives during his final months demonstrated his continued intellectual engagement with governmental responsibilities despite his physical incapacitation. The king worked with legal scholars to complete a comprehensive revision of the kingdom's law codes that clarified jurisdictional disputes and established clearer procedures for resolving conflicts between different legal traditions. These reforms addressed long-standing problems within the kingdom's complex legal system, while creating more efficient mechanisms for administration of justice that would benefit his successors. The economic policies implemented during this period reflected Baldwin's understanding of the financial foundations necessary to sustain prolonged military resistance against Islamic conquest attempts. Royal officials developed new commercial regulations that encouraged trade while ensuring that strategic resources remained under royal control. The coronation of Baldwin V on November 20th, 1183, had established the legal framework for succession, but the practical implementation of this arrangement required ongoing refinement as Baldwin IV's condition continued to deteriorate. The child king's public appearances were carefully orchestrated to demonstrate royal continuity while acknowledging his youth and inexperience. These ceremonies typically involved Baldwin V receiving the homage of various nobles while seated beside his great-uncle, whose presence provided legitimacy and continuity despite his obvious physical limitations. The relationship between the two Baldwins during these final months created poignant scenes that contemporary observers recorded with evident emotion. The leprous king would place his contracted hands on his nephew's shoulders during formal occasions, a gesture that symbolized the transfer of royal authority while demonstrating the older monarch's continued involvement in governmental affairs. The young prince showed remarkable composure during these events, maintaining the dignity expected of royalty while clearly understanding the gravity of his position and responsibilities. The ecclesiastical arrangements surrounding Baldwin's final period required delicate management of the theological questions that his condition continued to raise. Patriarch Heraclius and other senior clerics worked to maintain the interpretation that the king's suffering represented divine testing rather than punishment, citing biblical precedents and theological arguments that supported continued royal legitimacy. These efforts included regular public prayers for the king's spiritual welfare and formal declarations that his physical condition did not compromise his fitness for rule or the divine sanction underlying royal authority. The diplomatic initiatives undertaken during Baldwin's final months reflected both immediate military necessities and long-term strategic planning for the kingdom's survival. Royal envoys travelled throughout Europe seeking military and financial assistance, emphasizing the strategic importance of the Crusader states and the immediate threats posed by Saladin's expanding power. These missions required sophisticated understanding of European political dynamics and careful attention to the particular interests of different potential allies who might provide essential support during the coming conflicts. The intelligence networks established during Baldwin's reign provided crucial information about Islamic military preparations and political developments that enabled more effective defensive planning. These sources included merchants, pilgrims, and local inhabitants who possessed access to information about enemy activities and intentions. The coordination of intelligence gathering required careful management to protect sources while maximizing the value of their reports, creating sophisticated communication systems that operated throughout hostile territory. The final months of Baldwin's active involvement in governmental affairs were marked by increasing delegation of authority to trusted advisors who could implement royal policies while maintaining the appearance of direct royal control. Raymond III assumed primary responsibility for military planning and diplomatic negotiations, while other officials managed domestic administration, legal proceedings, and economic policy. This distribution of authority required constant coordination to prevent conflicts between different administrative spheres, while ensuring that major decisions received appropriate royal approval. The physical deterioration that characterised Baldwin's final period created practical challenges that extended beyond governmental concerns to encompass basic survival and comfort. The king required constant medical attention from physicians who understood leprosy's progression and could provide palliative care for its various symptoms. His diet had become severely restricted due to difficulties with swallowing and digestion, while his chronic pain required careful management through available medications and therapeutic techniques. The preparations for Baldwin's eventual death and the formal transfer of authority to Baldwin V accelerated during early 1185, as his condition showed unmistakable signs of approaching its final stage. These arrangements involved detailed planning for funeral ceremonies, succession procedures, and the immediate governmental actions necessary to maintain stability during the transition period. The complexity of these preparations reflected both the constitutional requirements for royal succession and the political sensitivities surrounding a leprous king's death and its potential interpretation by various audiences. The kingdom's military readiness during Baldwin's final months reflected both the extensive preparations undertaken during his reign and the recognition that major conflict was inevitable regardless of the timing of succession arrangements. The professional military units maintained high levels of training and equipment, while the fortification network provided defensive capabilities that could potentially withstand sustained Islamic assault. However, the fundamental demographic and resource limitations that had always constrained Crusader military power remained unchanged, creating strategic vulnerabilities that effective leadership and tactical innovation could mitigate but never completely eliminate. The death of Baldwin IV on March 16, 1185, marked the end of an era that would be remembered as both the zenith of individual Crusader heroism and the beginning of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's inexorable decline. The 24-year-old monarch succumbed to the advanced complications of leprosy in the early hours of dawn, his final moments witnessed only by his most trusted attendants and the physician who had monitored his deteriorating condition throughout the winter months. Contemporary accounts describe his death as peaceful, with the king maintaining consciousness until the end, despite the severe neurological damage that had rendered him nearly blind and unable to speak clearly for months. The immediate aftermath of Baldwin's death revealed both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of the governmental structure he had worked to establish during his 11-year reign. Raymond III of Tripoli, acting with the decisive authority that had characterized his regency, immediately secured the royal palace and treasury, while dispatching messengers to inform the kingdom's major nobles and military commanders of the succession. The 7-year-old Baldwin V was formally proclaimed king within hours of his great-uncle's death, with the coronation ceremony conducted in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre before potential opponents could organize resistance to the predetermined succession arrangements. However, the political consensus that had enabled this smooth transition proved tragically fragile when tested by subsequent challenges. Guy de Lusignan, whose marriage to Sibylla had positioned him as a potential future ruler, initially accepted the regency arrangements that placed Raymond III in control of governmental affairs during the child king's minority. The Poitevin noble understood that immediate opposition to the established succession would likely fail and could permanently damage his long-term prospects for power. His apparent acquiescence masked deeper resentments and ambitions that would emerge with devastating consequences when circumstances provided opportunities for political manoeuvring. The brief reign of Baldwin V lasted only 13 months, ending with the child's death in August 1186, under circumstances that generated suspicions of poisoning among contemporary observers. While no definitive evidence of foul play emerged, the timing of the young king's demise proved remarkably convenient for those who had opposed Raymond III's regency and sought to alter the kingdom's political direction. The boy's death eliminated the last obstacle to Sibylla's direct claim to the throne, creating opportunities for Guy de Lusignan to achieve the royal authority that had eluded him during the previous regency arrangements. The coronation of Sibylla and Guy as joint rulers in September 1186 represented a complete repudiation of Baldwin IV's careful succession planning and marked the beginning of the political catastrophe that would culminate at Hattin. Raymond III's exclusion from these proceedings, despite his legal claims as regent and his extensive governmental experience, created an immediate crisis of legitimacy that divided the kingdom's nobility into irreconcilable factions. The Count of Tripoli's subsequent alliance with Saladin, while tactically understandable given his political isolation, provided the Islamic commander with crucial intelligence about Crusader military capabilities and strategic planning that would prove decisive in future campaigns. Guy de Lusignan's assumption of royal authority demonstrated immediately the accuracy of Baldwin IV's concerns about his brother-in-law's fitness for kingship. The new monarch's first major policy decisions revealed fundamental misunderstandings of the diplomatic and military realities that governed Crusader survival in the hostile environment of the Levant. His rejection of the pragmatic accommodation policies that had characterized Baldwin's approach to Islamic relations, combined with his support for Reynald of Chatillon's increasingly provocative attacks on Muslim commerce and pilgrimage routes, created a diplomatic crisis that made major warfare virtually inevitable. The military innovations that Baldwin IV had developed during his reign represented perhaps his most significant contribution to medieval warfare, though their full implications would only become apparent through subsequent analysis by military historians. The leprous king's adaptation of traditional Crusader-heavy cavalry tactics to accommodate defensive operations created new strategic possibilities that maximized the effectiveness of limited manpower, while minimizing exposure to the numerical superiority that Islamic armies typically enjoyed. His systematic integration of infantry crossbow units with cavalry formations provided fire support capabilities that disrupted enemy formations and created opportunities for concentrated attacks against specific tactical objectives. Baldwin's defensive strategies emphasized the coordinated use of fortified positions to channel enemy movements while creating opportunities for concentrated counterattacks that could achieve local superiority despite overall numerical disadvantage. This approach required sophisticated understanding of terrain analysis, logistics coordination, and communication systems that enabled multiple military units to operate effectively across extensive geographic areas. The mathematical precision with which Baldwin calculated artillery, placement, siege defense arrangements, and supply requirements demonstrated intellectual capabilities that compensated for his physical limitations while establishing new standards for strategic planning in medieval warfare. The tactical innovations developed during Baldwin's campaigns against Saladin influenced military thinking throughout Europe as reports of Crusader battles reached Western audiences through returning pilgrims, merchants, and military personnel. The integration of engineering capabilities with traditional knightly warfare, the systematic use of intelligence networks for strategic planning, and the coordination of diverse military units under unified command structures provided models that European commanders adapted to their own regional conflicts. The emphasis on defensive positioning and tactical flexibility, rather than relying solely on the shock value of heavy cavalry charges, represented a significant evolution in medieval military doctrine. Contemporary Islamic sources provide remarkably consistent assessments of Baldwin IV's military capabilities and personal character that transcend the religious and cultural divisions of the medieval period. Saladin's own correspondence, preserved in various Arabic chronicles, acknowledges the leprous king as a formidable opponent whose strategic acumen and tactical innovation presented serious challenges to Islamic reconquest efforts. The Kurdish commander's respect for Baldwin's military leadership, expressed in private communications with subordinate officers, contrasts sharply with his dismissive attitudes toward other Crusader leaders and suggests genuine recognition of exceptional capability despite ideological opposition. The historian Ibn al-Athir, writing within decades of Baldwin's death, describes the leprous king as possessing remarkable courage and intelligence that enabled him to achieve military successes despite physical disabilities that would have incapacitated lesser men. This assessment, coming from a chronicler who generally portrayed Crusader leaders in negative terms, indicates the profound impression that Baldwin's achievements made on Islamic observers who witnessed his campaigns firsthand. The Arabic sources particularly emphasize Baldwin's personal participation in military operations, despite his obvious physical limitations, interpreting this behaviour as evidence of exceptional dedication to his royal duties. Later Islamic historians, including al-Makrizi and Ibn Taghribirdi, incorporated assessments of Baldwin IV into broader analyses of the Crusader period that recognised his reign as representing the final period of effective Christian resistance to Islamic reconquest efforts. These sources attribute the Kingdom of Jerusalem's survival during the 1170s and early 1180s primarily to Baldwin's leadership capabilities, while arguing that his death removed the primary obstacle to Saladin's territorial ambitions. The consistency of these evaluations across different time periods and political contexts suggests that Baldwin's reputation for military competence transcended contemporary propaganda considerations. William of Tyre's chronicle provides the most detailed contemporary Christian assessment of Baldwin's reign, combining intimate personal knowledge of the king's character and capabilities with sophisticated analysis of the political and military challenges that define the period. The Archbishop's account emphasises Baldwin's intellectual development under his tutelage, while acknowledging the extraordinary difficulties created by his advancing leprosy. William's medical observations provide crucial documentation of the disease's progression through Baldwin's body, creating a unique historical record of medieval leprosy that has informed subsequent medical and historical research. The theological implications of Baldwin's successful reign despite his leprosy created lasting impacts on medieval Christian thinking about the relationship between physical condition and divine favour. William of Tyre's arguments defending Baldwin's legitimacy drew upon sophisticated theological scholarship that challenged traditional assumptions about disease and spiritual worthiness. These intellectual developments contributed to broader changes in medieval attitudes toward disability and divine judgment that influenced both ecclesiastical doctrine and secular legal principles throughout Europe. Later Christian chroniclers, including those writing after the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, consistently portrayed Baldwin IV as a heroic figure whose personal courage and strategic brilliance provided the kingdom's only effective defence against overwhelming Islamic pressure. The contrast between Baldwin's successful military leadership and the catastrophic failures of his successors became a central theme in Crusader historiography, with many sources arguing that the leprous king's death marked the beginning of divine abandonment of the Crusader cause. This interpretation, while reflecting medieval theological assumptions, also acknowledged the practical reality that Baldwin's unique combination of intellectual capability and political skill had been essential for Crusader survival during a critical period. The enduring legacy of Baldwin IV as a symbol of courage and determination in the face of overwhelming adversity transcended the immediate historical context of the Crusades to influence broader medieval concepts of kingship and leadership. His demonstration that effective rule could be maintained despite severe physical disabilities challenged traditional assumptions about the relationship between bodily perfection and royal authority. The leprous king's success in commanding respect from both allies and enemies while managing complex political and military challenges provided a model of leadership that emphasized intellectual capability and moral authority over physical prowess. Medieval concepts of disability underwent subtle but significant changes, partly as a result of Baldwin's reign, with theological and legal scholars developing more nuanced interpretations of the relationship between physical condition and spiritual or political fitness. The success of a leprous king in defending Christian territories against Islamic conquest efforts provided powerful arguments against automatic assumptions about divine disfavour toward those suffering from disease or disability. These intellectual developments contributed to gradual changes in medieval attitudes that would eventually influence broader social and legal approaches to disability throughout European society. The influence of Baldwin's reign on later medieval kingship extended beyond questions of disability to encompass broader issues of royal authority and governmental effectiveness. His demonstration that successful rule could be maintained through delegation of authority to competent subordinates while preserving essential royal prerogatives provided models for other monarchs facing physical or political limitations. The administrative innovations developed during his reign, including improved communication systems, enhanced record-keeping procedures, and more efficient coordination between different governmental functions, influenced royal administration throughout Europe. The strategic lessons derived from Baldwin's military campaigns continue to influence medieval warfare long after the fall of the Crusader states. His integration of defensive positioning with offensive operations, his systematic use of intelligence gathering for tactical planning, and his coordination of diverse military units under unified command structures provided models that European commanders adapted to their own regional conflicts. The emphasis on maximizing the effectiveness of limited resources through superior planning and coordination became particularly relevant for smaller kingdoms facing larger enemies, creating strategic doctrines that remained influential throughout the medieval period. The diplomatic innovations that characterized Baldwin's approach to Islamic relations demonstrated possibilities for coexistence and negotiation that transcended the religious rhetoric typically associated with the Crusades. His willingness to engage directly with Muslim leaders, his understanding of Islamic culture and legal principles, and his recognition that military solutions alone could not ensure Crusader survival provided alternative models for Christian-Islamic relations that influenced subsequent diplomatic efforts. The pragmatic accommodation policies that he developed, while ultimately abandoned by his successors, suggested possibilities for peaceful coexistence that would be rediscovered by later generations. The rapid collapse of effective Crusader resistance following Baldwin's death provided stark evidence of his unique importance to the kingdom's survival. Guy de Lusignan's disastrous leadership at the Battle of Hattin in July 1187, where the entire royal army was destroyed and the king himself captured, demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of abandoning the strategic principles that Baldwin had developed through years of careful analysis and practical experience. The loss of Jerusalem itself in October 1187, less than 3 years after Baldwin's death, marked the end of nearly a century of Christian rule in the Holy City and validated the leprous king's warnings about the kingdom's fundamental vulnerabilities. The contrast between Baldwin's successful defensive strategies and the offensive disasters that characterized Guy's reign became a central theme in subsequent historical analysis of the Crusader period. Military historians have consistently argued that Baldwin's emphasis on defensive positioning, careful resource management, and tactical flexibility provided the kingdom's only realistic hope for long-term survival against Saladin's superior numbers and resources. The abandonment of these strategies in favour of aggressive policies that played to Islamic strengths, rather than Crusader advantages, created the conditions that made the disaster at Hattin virtually inevitable. The legacy of Baldwin IV ultimately transcends the immediate context of medieval warfare and political struggle to encompass broader questions about human potential and the relationship between physical limitation and achievement. His demonstration that severe disability need not preclude effective leadership, that intellectual capability could compensate for physical weakness, and that moral authority could be maintained despite visible disfigurement, provided inspiration that extended far beyond the historical circumstances of his reign. The leprous king's story became a testament to the possibility of overcoming seemingly insurmountable obstacles through courage, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to duty. The historical reputation of Baldwin IV has remained remarkably consistent across different time periods and cultural contexts, with both medieval and modern historians recognizing his reign as representing the final period of effective Crusader resistance to Islamic reconquest. His personal courage in the face of a debilitating disease, his strategic brilliance in military campaigns against overwhelming odds, and his political skill in managing complex factional divisions within the kingdom created a legacy that has inspired admiration even among those who opposed the broader Crusader enterprise. The leprous king story continues to resonate as an example of individual heroism and effective leadership under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. In the final analysis, Baldwin IV's 11-year reign represented both the culmination of Crusader military achievement and the last realistic hope for the Kingdom of Jerusalem's survival as an independent Christian state. His death at age 24 removed the only leader who had demonstrated the capability to resist Saladin's expanding power while maintaining the complex political balances that Crusader society required for effective governance. The rapid collapse that followed his death validated his strategic insights, while highlighting the tragic consequences of the political divisions that he had worked unsuccessfully to resolve. The Leper King's legacy endures as a testament to the triumph of human will over physical limitation, and as a reminder that individual leadership can prove decisive even in the face of seemingly inevitable historical forces.